Chapter 26:01. The many wisdom ancestors who had already arrived at the surface of the ice plains did not hesitate for long in front of the barrier. They could sense that although there were some dangers behind the barrier, there were also greater opportunities. They had already sacrificed so much for this opportunity. They had even abandoned their homes and their past. Under such circumstances, how could they retreat at the critical juncture where they were about to obtain this opportunity? This time, these wisdom ancestors did not wait for one of them to leave first. Instead, they all chose to cross the barrier together with the other wisdom ancestors. The moment they crossed the barrier, they felt a mysterious power that they had been longing for continuously surge into their bodies. The originally weak laws that belonged to the otherworldly variants in their bodies began to expand wildly. In this expansion, an indescribable sense of fullness rose from their hearts, making them all feel indescribably satisfied. At this moment, from the perspective of normal living beings, the surface of the ice field was suddenly filled with many spots of light that were expanding crazily. A large amount of heat continued to gather towards these spots of light, causing the heat of these spots of light to increase. This change made it even more conspicuous on the surface of the ice field. Although the surface temperature of the ice field was much lower than that of the normal world, the temperature of the ice field was much lower than that of the normal world. However, it did not turn into ice after all. It did not become a part of the ice field below, so there was still some heat. To the wisdom ancestors that had emerged from the depths of the ice plains, this heat was like a sun that was constantly roasting them. Although all of them could feel that their bodies were becoming more and more complete and powerful, they could also feel that their essence was constantly collapsing and dispersing in this burning process. It was as if his own foundation wasn't strong enough to support his own perfection and strength. Faced with such a situation, the wisdom ancestors could not help but feel an indescribable sense of panic. They were doing all they could to stabilize themselves and strengthen their foundations. Since they were unable to do so, they could only seek to return to the icy plains below and seek the protection of the boundless coldness below. However, it was a pity that it was easy to come out, but it was not so easy to go back. This was especially so at this moment, when their essence could be said to have been assimilated by the heat of the outside world. Now, as soon as they approached the icy plains below, they would feel their bodies and minds rapidly collapsing and being destroyed. In fact, although it was originally disintegrating their essence, it was also automatically surging into their bodies and continuously strengthening their bodies. At the same time, it started to explode, and when it came into contact with the chill, it erupted with world-shaking destructive power. The best-case scenario for the wisdom ancestors was to have half of their bodies destroyed at this time. These ancestors of wisdom were like ordinary people who were blocked by two fierce tigers in an alley. They couldn't move forward, and they couldn't retreat for a time. They could only watch helplessly as they were assimilated by the endless heat around them. Gradually, their essence disintegrated and dispersed into the endless void around them, slowly disappearing without a trace. I should have waited a little longer. This thought appeared in the minds of the wisdom ancestors one after another, just as they were about to completely disintegrate in the eyes of ordinary living beings. As these points of view continued to expand, they suddenly couldn't withstand the invisible existence that was constantly pouring into their bodies. In the end, under the impact of that invisible existence, they exploded and formed miniature fireworks. Countless tiny specks of light floated in the void. At this moment, there were still countless amounts of heat continuously gathering towards these light spots that had exploded, causing these light spots to continue to expand under such circumstances. In the end, at a certain moment, the specks of light expanded to a certain stage and exploded once again. Following that, the specks of light continued to absorb the endless heat and continued to expand before exploding to a certain extent. Just like this, the number of specks of light increased at an unimaginable speed. In just a few days, they had already turned into a huge ball of light that was hundreds of feet in diameter. Floating on the surface of the ice field, It was like a black hole that constantly attracted endless heat from the outside world into this ball of light. As the endless heat poured in, the surface of the ball of light constantly crackled and exploded, as if countless small bombs had appeared inside the ball of light and were detonating at every moment. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of mournful wails and screams appearing inside the ball of light, causing the originally indescribably sacred ball of light to show an indescribable coldness and strangeness. As the ball of light absorbed the heat, the surrounding temperature became lower and lower. Faintly, there were even specks of frost appearing around the ball of light. These specks of frost gathered in the void and slowly surged along with the surging heat. In the end, they seemed to have turned into a cloud of mist that shrouded the ball of light. As the ball of light moved, it produced corresponding changes, looking like the clouds and mist that followed the divine dragon. The heat in the ice field was originally much less than that in other normal regions. After the ball of light crazily absorbed the heat, the temperature naturally decreased even more rapidly. It even looked like the ice field had begun to spread upwards. At the very least, the ice field below this position began to slowly extend upwards, as if the ice field surface was gradually bulging, gradually pushing the ball of light upwards. This kind of change continued until the newly born source of light in the depths of the ice plain below was so bright that it looked like the depths of the ice had swallowed a bright moon, appearing incomparably conspicuous at this time. It had already been several decades since the ball of light was born. In these several decades, the ball of light had already expanded to several hundred miles wide. The entire scale had already reached a level that ordinary living beings couldn't ignore. At this time, the explosion of the light that was happening at every moment seemed incomparably huge. Countless explosions mixed together, as if a huge thunderclap was constantly ringing out from the surface of the ice field. This kind of earth-shattering activity had even affected the ice field below, causing the changes in the ice field below to become increasingly intense. Moreover, due to the loss of heat, the ice that had already begun to bulge had already turned into a mountain after several decades of development. Although it wasn't as tall as the clouds, it was at least several hundred feet away from the ground. It looked like an ice mountain had suddenly appeared in the depths of the ice field. On this day, a few decades after the ball of light appeared, the thunderous explosion that came from within suddenly stopped. Then it began to change direction. From the original unceasingly increasing in size and height, it began to continuously shrink. As it changed, the constant explosions on the surface and the depths of the ball of light gradually decreased. In the end, after another few years, all the explosions completely disappeared. The explosions within the ball of light had also completely stopped. The entire ball of light seemed to have become extremely stable, hovering at the top of the ice mountain. It slowly wriggled, as if some kind of invisible transformation was occurring within it. As for the miserable howls that lingered within the ball of light for the past few decades, at this time, it was completely gone. Moreover, there was even a faint, indescribable vitality gradually being born within the ball of light. The ball of light gradually wriggled, and as it wriggled, it gradually matched an indescribable rhythm, a rhythm that was filled with vitality. This rhythm was similar to a heartbeat, similar to breathing, and even more similar to the rise and fall of the waves. This rhythm lasted for a long time. Then, at a certain moment, the rhythm suddenly began to accelerate. As it sped up, the ball of light continued to shrink with each rhythm. In just a few days, the ball of light had already shrunk to the size of a human. At this time, suddenly, a thunderous sound appeared within the ball of light. Then, the ball of light suddenly exploded, and a figure gradually emerged from the fragments of light. The surrounding frost, mist also evaporated at this instant. All the mist quickly dispersed, as if there was a sun in the center that was madly burning the frost in the surroundings. Then, with a soft plop, the figure that emerged from the light went limp and fell to the ground. This figure had the appearance of a young man. At this moment, he was lying on the ground naked. His body was steaming, and the ice under his body that came into contact with him began to melt rapidly. Gradually, it turned into ice water, then into mist, and in the end, it evaporated and disappeared into the void. The young man crawled up in a daze. He looked at himself, then at his surroundings. His eyes were filled with confusion, as if he couldn't remember anything. Who am I? Where am I? Where am I going? These three questions appeared in his heart. He faintly felt that there were countless memories in his heart, but these memories were separated from him by a layer. He could see and feel them, but he clearly understood that these were not his memories. At the very least, they were not the memories that he understood. They were more like the memories of his predecessor. In these memories, he seemed to be the ancestor of wisdom. Furthermore, it wasn't just one ancestor of wisdom, but many, many ancestors of wisdom. In those memories, he guided civilization after civilization, nurtured civilization after civilization, and carried out cultivation after cultivation. In the end, he raised himself to an unimaginable level. In the end, he transcended the world, transcended the heavens, and entered outer space. Then, due to the erosion of outer space, he died, his soul scattered. Is this outer space? There doesn't seem to be anything special. He looked up at the sky and felt that the sky was no different from the sky in his own world. Moreover, this place seems to limit my power. My current strength is at most the limit of an ordinary living being. I can't even fly. Then, he used the many techniques he obtained from his memories to examine himself, and he couldn't help but smile bitterly. At this moment, the heat in his body was continuously being stripped away by the outside world. A feeling that he had never felt in his memories surged into his heart. It was the feeling of coldness. I can't go on like this. If this goes on, I'll die. With that thought, the living being looked around, trying to find a place that could avoid the invasion of the cold. However, it was a pity that this was the depths of the vast and boundless ice field. From here, one could see that the entire area within sight was covered in ice. In a place like this, it was almost impossible to find a place that could resist the cold and maintain the heat in one's body. Am I going to lose the life I just obtained here? Looking at the ice all around him, the living being couldn't help but feel despair. Although he felt despair, this living being was the ancestor of many wisdom. After all, he wouldn't give up so easily. At this moment, although he couldn't find any hope, he still slowly climbed down the ice mountain and trudged into the distance with difficulty. A large amount of heat gathered on his body, but he didn't know how to control it. At this moment, he could only allow the cold outside to continuously neutralize his heat, causing it to continuously dissipate outside his body. This made his body seem steaming hot, as if there was smoke lingering around him. As he trudged, every step he took left a mark on the layer of ice below him that was neither deep nor shallow. As he left, these marks were quickly filled up by the cold due to the cold. In just a few breaths' time, a shallow pit was formed, and after another few breaths' time, the pit disappeared. As the heat dissipated, the living being felt more and more uncomfortable. It was as if his vitality was being stripped away bit by bit. Chapter 26:02. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was at the source of the cold rule, suddenly snapped out of his daze from his deeper analysis of the source of the heat rule in his body. This feeling is somewhat similar to the extension of the bloodline. He secretly thought about the feeling that caused him to break away from that immersion and made a judgment in his heart. The result of this judgment was quite ridiculous, and it seemed to be a situation that was completely impossible. After all, it had been billions of trillions of years since he had transmigrated, and Luo Fan had not left behind any bloodline descendants. Even if he had some descendants, they were merely obtained through various coincidences. He didn't leave behind any of his true bloodline. Under such circumstances, the sudden appearance of a bloodline descendant was an extremely absurd matter, no matter how one looked at it. However, Luo Fan did not treat this feeling as an illusion and completely ignore it. After all, at his level, everything he sensed must have a source. It was almost impossible for an illusion to happen to him. Therefore, at this moment, he put aside the absurdity and started to trace the source of that feeling, searching for the existence that made him feel this way. Luo Fan had spent quite a long time in the origin of the cold laws. Although it wasn't as long as the so-called time in the ice field where tens of thousands of years had passed, it still wasn't as long as the so-called time in the myriad worlds. However, it was already quite impressive. After such a long period of analysis and refinement, his realm had improved quite a bit compared to before. Whether it was his view of the world, his body, or the amount of heat in his body, they were all much better than before. As such, the strength that he could exert in this world had unknowingly risen to the level of a pseudo-saint. This kind of strength was naturally insignificant compared to the peak level of a sixth tribulation expert. However, compared to other existences who could not use transcendent means, this kind of strength already had a crushing advantage. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and in an instant, countless information began to surge into his heart. Over the years, everything that had happened in the so-called multiverse within the ice plains, whether it was the birth of the Wisdom Ancestor, the plans of the Wisdom Ancestor, the birth of the new multiverse, the invasion of the old multiverse, and so on and so forth, everything had been imprinted in his heart without any reservation, like the lines on his palm. He had understood everything without any reservation. In the end, he locked his gaze on the ice field, at the creature that had just been born and had a very clear humanoid figure. It was actually born with the help of my laws. From a certain point of view, it can indeed be considered as my bloodline descendant. Looking at the creature, Luo Fan did not know whether to laugh or cry. The birth of a new myriad worlds was an accident for him. It was because his body had entered the origin of the laws of cold, causing some strange ripples to form in the origin of the laws of cold. The effects were mutual. The origin of the laws of cold could stimulate the origin of the laws of heat in Luo Fan's body, causing the mysteries of the origin of the laws of heat to be revealed in front of Luo Fan. Similarly, the origin of the laws of heat would definitely have a reaction against the origin of the laws of cold. This reaction might not be as strong as the stimulation of the origin of the laws of cold to the origin of the laws of heat, but it still existed given the position of the source of the cold law in this ice field. The final effect of such a change was rather impressive. As a result, the new myriad worlds were born. As a result, the entire ice field was violently shaken. As a result, the ancestors of wisdom saw a way to transcend, and they did their best to refine the laws that had appeared in the depths of the ice field because of them. Then, the creature that was shivering in front of Luo Fan was finally born. All of this could be said to be a fortuitous coincidence, but it could also be said to be an inevitability within chance. As long as Luo Fan entered the origin of the laws of cold, then all of these changes would eventually appear. The only difference was the length of time, as well as the identity of the existence that ultimately formed this figure. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care much about this so-called bloodline descendant. After all, its birth was merely an accident, and it was not his will. Moreover, it was only born because of the laws he had influenced. Strictly speaking, it could not be considered a bloodline descendant. Under these various circumstances, how could Luo Fan admit that the creature was his bloodline descendant? However, although he acknowledged that the creature was his bloodline descendant, it was still born because of the laws he had influenced, and there was a subtle connection between them. Hence, Luo Fan could not just watch it freeze to death on the surface of the ice field. At this moment, seeing that the creature was walking slower and slower, and that its body was gradually turning into ice, Luo Fan finally sighed. With a slight thought, a wave of heat trembled in his body, and then disappeared without a trace. Then, on the surface of the ice field that was at least a few million kilometers away from him, a wave of heat suddenly appeared above the head of the creature that was trudging with difficulty. This wave of heat was so grand, so vast. The moment it appeared, the surrounding ice directly evaporated and turned into smoke, completely dispersing. At this moment, the creature also felt indescribable waves of warmth continuously seeping into its body from all directions, causing the chill in its body to completely disperse at an unimaginable speed. "What is this?" The creature was stunned. It raised its head and looked in the direction where the heat came from. In that position, there was a group of invisible existences that were rotating slightly. The invisible object itself was incorporeal. Ordinary creatures should not be able to discover its existence even if they looked in that direction. However, at this moment, due to its own characteristics and the fact that it carried too much heat, the surrounding air became extremely distorted and deformed. Unknowingly, that invisible and intangible existence was highlighted. It was precisely because of this that the creature, who is still no different from an ordinary person, could see the invisible object at a glance. What a powerful source of heat! A sense of astonishment surfaced in its heart. To him, this shapeless and intangible existence was simply the purest and most powerful source of heat in the world. It felt like even the sun in the sky couldn't compare to this source of heat. Not to mention anything else at this moment, the ice below where it was standing was also rapidly rising. It continuously turned from ice into mist, continuously rising into the air and gradually dissipating in the void. If not for the endless chill surging up at every moment to resist this corrosion, the creature would have fallen into the deep pit that was formed due to the disappearance of the ice, as if it had fallen into an abyss. However, even so, he felt that the ice beneath his feet was no longer cold. Instead, it was warm. Stepping on it was indescribably comfortable. This was the effect of the equilibrium formed by the interaction of heat and cold. At a glance, the ice within a range of several hundred kilometers was covered by the mist. Clearly, this was because the range of effect of this ball of heat was not limited to the creature's surroundings, but the entire area within a range of several hundred kilometers. All the ice in this entire area was simultaneously enduring the test of this heat, enduring the scorching heat. At this moment, the ball of heat shook slightly, and like a falling meteorite, it ruthlessly smashed towards the creature. In this world, this creature could only display the strength of an ordinary creature. Faced with this scene of a falling meteorite, it could only raise its hand to block it. It could only watch as the ball of heat directly rushed into its body. As the heat rushed in, the creature felt as if it had swallowed the entire sun. Endless heat was continuously released. Not only did it fill the interior of its body, but it also nourished its body as if it was being roasted. It nourished its spirit, and it nourished the heat that had almost been worn out in its body. As this happened, the creature's body seemed to have turned into a sun. Endless heat kept being released from its body, even burning the air around it, causing the surrounding air to turn into hot wind that blew in all directions. As the wind blew, the creature's body began to float involuntarily. It gradually left the ice and flew into the sky. Of course, it was not because it had obtained the heat, but because it was able to display extraordinary abilities in this world and display the effects of extraordinary abilities. Instead, because of the heat, the air around it expanded and became less dense, forming a difference in density between it and the air outside. As a result, buoyancy was produced, and the creature's body began to float upwards. One must know that around this creature, there was no obvious boundary between the air that was being burned and the air outside. Even so, the buoyancy was enough for the creature to float. This was enough to show how terrifying the heat coming from its body was. Only when the terrifying heat caused the temperature of the surrounding air to rise rapidly enough that the exchange of air could not make up for the reduced density of air again could something like this happen. Go. This place is still too dangerous for you now. When you can use extraordinary abilities, come back to see your home. At this moment, a voice appeared in the creature's mind out of nowhere. This voice came from the source of heat, or rather, from the existence that sent the source of heat into its body. Who are you? Who am I? The creature shouted at this moment. Compared to itself, it seemed to be more concerned about this. However, the source of heat did not reply to this question. At this moment, The heat from the source of heat was continuously emitted, continuously filling its body and fusing with its heat. It even faintly controlled the heat in its body to form an extremely crude circulation inside its body, absorbing more and more heat into this circulation. Following these changes, the amount of heat released from the creature's body continuously decreased. As the heat decreased, the speed at which the temperature of the surrounding air rose began to slow down. The buoyancy that was supporting it naturally began to decrease. As a result, the creature's speed of ascension also began to gradually slow down. Fortunately, when it stopped, it was already high up in the sky. Looking down at the ice field below, it could already barely see the boundary and the outline of the basin. Although this creature had just been born not long ago, it was formed from the many fragments of the wisdom ancestors after all. It possessed most of the memories of the wisdom ancestors. Although it could not say that it completely possessed the strength and wisdom of the wisdom ancestors, it also knew many tricks to using power. At this moment, seeing that it could not get an answer from the source of heat, and if it did not take action, it would probably fall back down like a stone and smash into a meat paste on the surface of the ice field. The creature could only sigh and control a portion of the heat that it could control, spurting it out of the many acupoints on its back. As the heat spurted out, its body was pushed back by an unimaginable force. It left a white mark in the void and quickly flew towards the end of the ice field in the distance. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared without a trace. It had listened to the voice from the source of heat and left this ice field first. One day, when it could use its extraordinary power, it would return to this ice field to explore it. It won't be long before I return. This was what the creature was thinking at the last moment before it left. The reason why it thought this way was naturally not just because it was conceited. Instead, it could sense that the heat contained in the source of heat that had entered its body was far greater than the limits of its imagination. With the support of such a vast amount of heat, it would be successful no matter what it did. Even if it used its extraordinary power, it should not be difficult. Chapter 26:03. At this moment, the heat energy in Luo Fan's body was complete and flawless. It circulated endlessly in the heat circulation system, and it didn't decrease at all because he had given some to that creature. After all, that heat energy would take the creature tens of thousands of years to digest before it could be completely digested. However, compared to Luo Fan, it was really not even a drop in the ocean. For him, that little bit of heat energy was completely replenished in just a breath's time. How could it have been just a breath's time since he sent out the heat energy? It was probably dozens of breaths or even hundreds of breaths' time. How could such a long time not be enough for him to completely recover all the heat energy he had just lost? At this moment, his entire body was complete and flawless, and his body and mind were in an incomparably perfect state. Compared to the bloodline connection between him and that creature, the world that was gradually transforming also had some kind of connection that was constantly being established with him. This kind of connection was a little shallower and more distant than the bloodline connection. However, it was also a rather close connection. Under this connection, this world was almost about to transform into the world that he had created. The most fundamental core law was unknowingly moving closer to his worldview of laws. Vaguely, almost all the circulation of laws, power, and even the various invisible definitions were gradually fitting with his worldview of laws and his most fundamental way of thinking. If it was really a world that he had created, Luo Fuan naturally wouldn't care about such changes. After all, even if he were to fight with others, the power that he exerted would easily create thousands of worlds. What was an additional world that he had created to him? However, this didn't mean that he didn't care about this world establishing a connection with him. This was because this was the difference between being active and being passive. He was willing to take the initiative, so of course he wouldn't feel anything. However, it was different if he was passive. This kind of passive method made him feel as if he was being forced to do something. This feeling of being forced made him feel rather displeased, and he almost recalled the feeling of powerlessness when he was still extremely weak. In this way, at this time, what Luo Fan wanted to do was very obvious, severing the connection between himself and that world, allowing that world to return to its original state that had nothing to do with him. As his gaze flickered, his eyes had already pierced through the barrier of endless ice, and he saw that world. He saw everything in that world clearly, and he even traced back to the depths of that world, to the countless cracks that had existed in the past and were still existing now. At this moment, the cracks were rapidly closing up. Some mysterious existence was constantly filling up the cracks in a subtle manner, filling up every inch of the cracks, allowing the cracks to close up at an extremely fast speed. Other living beings might not be able to sense the existence of these cracks being mended and repaired, but he was extremely clear about it. That was the heat that he had modified. In other words, it was imbued with all sorts of subtle and profound heat from the world of laws. This kind of heat was extremely mysterious. Not only did it possess the characteristics of heat, but it also possessed the characteristics of Luo Fan himself. It could be said that it was an extension of his body and power. Currently, the proportion of this heat that occupied the entire world was not much, and he had only established some basic and vague connections with this world. When the amount of this heat occupied became the main body of that world, then the connection between him and the world would become impossible to sever. Luo Fan's eyes flickered, and in an instant, his will had already cut into the countless invisible existences that were connected to him. From a physical point of view, those invisible existences had nothing to do with Luo Fan. Their formation was brought by the living beings of the new worlds that were naturally born in this ice field, and the process of their integration into this world was completely dependent on the war between the living beings of the new worlds and the old worlds. Everything could be said to have no direct connection with Luo Fan. However, it was obvious that for an existence at Luo Fan's level, establishing a connection did not require a direct physical connection. As long as there were similarities in terms of cultivation, profound mysteries, and principles, then the connection would be established. Just like how those seventh tribulation powerhouses could use the cultivation path they left behind to directly cross the two worlds and resurrect themselves after their main bodies died. Luo Fan also had a similar characteristic. The invisible existences that were closing the cracks in this world were using the same heat that Luo Fan had after he integrated with the world of laws. This had already established a direct connection with him. And because of this, Luo Fan could easily manipulate the heat like how he manipulated the heat in his body. He could even insert his will into the heat and use it to do whatever he wanted. In the depths of that world, the heat that had been enhanced by Luo Fan's will trembled slightly and broke away from the cracks that had been mended. With a flash, it turned into a figure in the void. It was a humanoid figure that looked exactly the same as Luo Fan, but was essentially illusory. Of course, this kind of illusory was naturally from Luo Fan's point of view. For this world and the living beings in this world, the figure that was now completely condensed from heat was the most real existence in this world. That place seemed to be constructed from the toughest material in the world that they knew of. When this figure appeared here, it began to frantically absorb the heat that existed in this world like a black hole. It was the heat that was born from the heat composition of Luo Fan's body. Endless heat was constantly peeled away from the cracks that had already mended and began to rapidly gather towards this figure. It continuously integrated into its body, making it more and more solid and powerful. When this figure had just been condensed, its might was already unbelievably strong. Now that it was supplemented by more heat, its strength had reached an even more unbelievable level. At this moment, the entire world began to tremble. Loud rumbling sounds reverberated throughout the entire world. The peak powerhouses that had almost completely integrated into this world felt the terror of the arrival of the end of the world. They couldn't help but panic. The sky became gloomy and cracks appeared out of thin air in the sky of this world. They kept increasing and increasing in size. In the end, it simply turned into a huge, irregular net that directly enveloped the entire sky of this world. Moreover, these cracks didn't stop at this moment. Instead, they continued to extend downwards and finally penetrated the ground below, causing the ground of this world to crack continuously. Moreover, the cracks became denser and denser. Although the cracks in the sky looked shocking, they were still in the sky. After all, seeing this kind of fissure would strike fear into the hearts of the living beings below, but to the living beings themselves, the threat was actually not that great. However, the cracks in the ground were different. For most living beings, the ground was the support of their survival and the place where most of their activities took place. Under such circumstances, more and more cracks appeared on the ground, and the impact on the living beings was self-evident. At this moment, the entire world became chaotic because of the appearance of these cracks. As more and more cracks appeared, the chaos also became more and more serious. In the end, the entire world even seemed to have fallen into an apocalyptic state. In this apocalyptic scale change, there was no longer any difference between invaders and anti-invaders in this world. There were only survivors, those who sought a place to live in the midst of a terrifying apocalyptic disaster were all survivors. What's going on? Who is fighting against this world? The peak powerhouses roared in horror. They had already obtained huge benefits in this world. Their bodies had become complete, their strength had been strengthened, and their intrinsic qualities had been improved. They even had an extremely bright future ahead of them. Under such circumstances, they no longer had the intention to leave this world. Moreover, due to the assimilation of the world, they had unknowingly held an extremely high position in this world. In this way, it went without saying how terrified they were of the sudden disaster in this world. At this moment, their hearts were filled with resentment and endless fear. If this world was really over, they didn't know how they would survive in the future. Amidst this fear, these peak powerhouses could only use their own strength to protect the areas they could protect so that the areas they guarded would not completely collapse. These peak powerhouses made the same choice, and their actions were shockingly similar at this moment. If these peak powerhouses could calm down and see the behavior of all the peak powerhouses in this world clearly, they would definitely notice this abnormality and think of more things. However, it was obvious that this shift didn't happen. At this moment, these peak powerhouses didn't even have time to protect themselves and the areas they guarded. So how would they have the mood to pay attention to the actions of other peak powerhouses? Therefore, they missed a great opportunity to discover the abnormality in themselves. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about all of this. At this moment, he was only focused on gathering the heat energy that had fused with the worldview of laws. He tried his best to absorb the heat energy from all parts of this world, whether it was in the void or in the cracks that had already closed, and completely turned it into growth resources for his heat energy clone at this moment. In terms of cultivation realm, he could actually be considered to have touched the realm of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. In this state, even though he could not unleash strength beyond what his current body possessed in this world, it was enough for him to use this bit of heat to unleash power that was unimaginable to any living being in this world. At this moment, he hadn't exerted his full strength yet, but the entire world was already trembling and was about to completely collapse. Clatter, clatter. Countless cracking sounds reverberated throughout the entire world at this moment, even suppressing the terrifying roars that reverberated throughout the world. Amidst the cracking sounds, the figure of Luo Fan's heat energy clone began to gradually appear in the world. Although it was just a heat energy clone condensed from some heat energy, it was an insignificant existence compared to Luo Fan himself. However, compared to this world, this incarnation was already an unbelievably terrifying existence. At this moment, the reason why it appeared on the surface of the world was not because Luo Fan wanted to do so. Instead, it was because the depths of the world could no longer accommodate the clone that had integrated so much heat energy. Who is this? At this moment, many living beings saw this indomitable blurry figure at this moment. Such a question emerged in the hearts of many living beings, making them feel both shocked and terrified. At this moment, a peak powerhouse seemed to recall something and exclaimed, "He looks a little like the legendary extraterrestrial abnormal creature." None of the living beings in this world had ever seen Luo Fan before. After all, although many living beings had discovered Luo Fan when he entered this icy field back then, only the ancestors of wisdom could truly survive until now. The other living beings had long perished over the years and disappeared without a trace in the numerous upheavals and wars. As for those new living beings in the myriad heavens realms, even the pinnacle powerhouses had never seen Luo Fan before. However, not seeing him did not mean that these peak powerhouses had no concept of Luo Fan's existence. Chapter 2604. At this moment, in the eyes of those peak experts, the blurry figure that emerged from the depths of the world was extremely similar to the otherworldly entity recorded in the books left by the wisdom ancestor. Why would the otherworldly entity appear here? Didn't they say that it had entered the deepest part of the void? The other peak experts also reacted. At this moment, intense panic spread throughout the world. The entire world seemed to have entered the final stage of collapse and destruction in the blink of an eye. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to have sensed something. With a sweep of his gaze, all the living beings in this world began to tremble slightly. Amidst the tremors, the heat that existed in these living beings began to dissipate. As if being forcibly extracted by some unimaginable power, the heat rapidly gathered towards the figure of the otherworldly being that had emerged from the deepest part of the world. With this change, all the living beings felt that they had lost all their senses. In a trance, they seemed to have become the walking dead, and the intense panic caused by the changes in the world had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. The various cries and screams that existed in the world could no longer be heard. It was as if the world had become a lifeless world. Evidently, Luo Fan had sensed that the living beings in this world also had the heat that originated from him. With a slight movement, he extracted the heat bit by bit. Evidently, those living beings had already fused with the heat, and the existence of the heat had long become an inseparable part of them. Under such circumstances, the loss of the heat was equivalent to severe damage to the integrity of these living beings. In this way, it would naturally have a significant impact on their thoughts. It was precisely because of this that it resulted in such a situation. They had clearly only lost some heat energy, but they had actually lost their ability to think. Of course, this was only temporary. After all, these living beings were not completely born because of Luo Fan's rules. After losing the heat, their bodies and minds were still qualified to derive their own thinking. In this way, as long as they had enough time to recuperate, they would eventually be able to derive their own thinking. It was just that, compared to before, his way of thinking was naturally a little different. Luo Fan didn't pay much attention to all of this. At this time, he just focused on guiding the heat that existed in the entire world that was affected by his worldview and constantly gathered it on his heat avatar, making his heat avatar more and more solid and huge. It also made the world tremble more and more violently, making the cracks that ran through the entire world become denser and bigger. This process lasted for several months. After a few months, Luo Fan's heat incarnation appeared in this world like a body of flesh and blood. The entire world was on the verge of disintegration. Or, to put it in a strict way, it had already collapsed. At this moment, rather than calling this world a single world, it would be more accurate to say that countless worlds were piled together. Those worlds had been completely separated by the cracks. Although their forms were complementary, and if the cracks disappeared, they could be regarded as a complete entity. However, there was no connection between them at all. In fact, even the various things inside those worlds were vaguely independent of each other at this time, each deriving the various rules and conditions required by a normal world. Now, if these worlds were squeezed by some external force and the cracks were closed, they could still form a new world and become a complete whole. However, once these separated worlds formed their own systems and derived the various things required by a complete world, then no matter how strong an external force was, it could only destroy them and not allow them to fuse with each other to form a complete world. It's finally done. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. After spending a few months, he had completely condensed all the heat that existed in this world and combined it with his worldview, turning it into a part of his heat avatar. Now only that's left. After secretly rejoicing for a while, Luo Fan shifted his gaze from this world to another place. That place was where the new worlds were located. One must know that the reason why this world had the heat that carried the worldview was actually because of the invaders from the new worlds. In other words, the new worlds were the source of the heat. If that was the case, if Luo Fan didn't pay attention to the new Myriad Heavens world, the world that was born from it, and the heat that was carried by the living beings that were fused with the worldview of laws, then his previous efforts over the past few months would be completely for naught. One day, when the living beings in the new Myriad Heavens realms grow up and discover this world once again, they will probably expand the heat energy to this world once more. Therefore, if he wanted to cut off the connection between this world and him, of course, he could only start from the new worlds and cut off everything from the very beginning. At this moment, the entire ice field was still shaking. This was because this world had split up once again, and the ability of these split worlds to withstand this change was much weaker than before. In the face of such turbulence, the world was constantly collapsing and falling. In just a few months, when Luo Fuan was absorbing the heat, hundreds of thousands of world fragments had already been destroyed in the ice field. Although these hundreds of thousands of world fragments were only world fragments now, as time passed and they had enough time to develop, they would definitely be able to turn into complete worlds. In other words, in just a few months, hundreds of thousands of embryonic worlds had already been destroyed. This number could be said to be quite shocking. However, such a situation was nothing compared to the entire world. Given the scale of this world, the number of fragments might not even be able to be counted in the trillions. But even if it was nothing, a world was still a world. Hundreds of thousands of worlds, this number was still extremely unbelievable. At this moment, faced with this kind of loss, Luo Fan could not help but frown slightly. Although he wanted to sever the connection between himself and this world so that he wouldn't be forced to establish a connection with this world by some kind of external force, it wasn't because he hated this world or anything like that. If he really had the emotions of the smoke, why would he waste time to condense this heat clone? He would have destroyed this world a long time ago. With such a mentality, he could see that this world would completely collapse if he left just like that. In the end, he still couldn't bear to do so. He sighed and his expression changed slightly. The heat clone raised his hand and waved it in the air. In an instant, it had already begun to control the endless chill in the surroundings, changing the way it circulated. Could it be that the Jian clan had formed a strange vortex that wrapped this world? Or rather, this broken world formed from countless world fragments in the center of the vortex? As the vortex formed, the connection between the world fragments and the outside world was completely severed. The entire world had suddenly become unprecedentedly stable. At this moment, the countless fragments that were constantly trembling and gradually disintegrating no longer trembled and disintegrated. Instead, they seemed to be pressured by some kind of invisible force and began to gradually gather towards the center. The cracks that existed within also began to shrink during this process. This should be enough. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind when he saw this scene. With this whirlpool from now on, this world would no longer be affected by the turbulence of the ice field outside. No matter how much turbulence there was in the outside world, all of the power would be absorbed by this vortex and would no longer affect this world. This way, no matter how this world developed in the future, at the very least, it would not be destroyed by the changes in the outside world. After Luo Fan finished all of this, he looked down from the surface of the ice field and discovered that the originally small, sun-like shadow had completely disappeared. The ice field seemed to have completely turned into an ordinary ice field that was constantly changing and re-finding its balance. There were no longer any special images. Evidently, Due to the loss of the heat that Luo Fan condensed on the heat avatar, the world had lost its original uniqueness. At the very least, it was no longer special to the point that it could be seen from the ice field that was tens of thousands of miles away. After doing all of this, Luo Fan did not stay in this world any longer. In a flash, the heat avatar disappeared from this world and headed to a new world. After Luo Fan left, the world suddenly trembled. Immediately afterward, the feeling that the entire world was gradually heading towards destruction and extinction disappeared without a trace. Moreover, due to the pressure emitted by the vortex, the countless cracks that originally existed in various parts of the world began to gradually close up. It felt like the process of reassembling the worlds that the Wisdom Ancestor had opened was starting again. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because when Luo Fan's heat avatar was here, it gave this world an incredible pressure. This kind of pressure was causing the world to fall towards the direction of collapse. It was precisely because of this that the world behaved as if it would inevitably collapse in the end. But in fact, this world had not reached that step yet. Don't forget that this world had roughly taken shape under the efforts of the many wisdom ancestors back then, and the many cracks in the depths of the world had also mostly closed up. The heat and laws that the invaders brought and integrated with Luo Fan's worldview were actually just icing on the cake, and they weren't necessary for this world to heal. In that case, even if the heat and rules were lost, it would merely be the icing on the cake for this world, and the cracks that had been mended would quickly open up again. But it really wasn't enough to completely collapse the entire world. Under such circumstances, the heat avatar that originally exerted incredible pressure on this world and made it seem like it was about to collapse left. Naturally, the healing power that was brewing a rebound in this world instantly occupied the main body of change, causing the countless cracked fragments of the world to begin to heal again. However, all of this went unnoticed by any living beings. Even the pinnacle powerhouses' minds were already blank due to the heat and laws that Luo Fan had integrated into their bodies being extracted by Luo Fan, and they couldn't think like normal people, let alone other living beings. In this way, this world change that clearly violated the development of nature didn't attract the attention of any living beings in this world at all. They just muddle-headedly wandered in this world according to their own instincts, trying to survive, trying hard to develop their own new thoughts, new consciousness. The healing process of this world was naturally an extremely long process, but that referred to the complete healing of the depths. In fact, it didn't take much time for the world's surface to heal. After another few months, the surface of the world seemed to have completely restored to a perfect and flawless state. The cracks that originally existed everywhere in this world like a three-dimensional network had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. This was also the first scene that the pinnacle powerhouses saw when they woke up and regained their thinking ability. Chapter 2605. Highly recommended. This creature is no longer the same as the original creature. Literary and literary novels. It has the same body, the same power, and even the same memories. However, it is a completely new existence. In terms of life essence, it is a completely different entity from the previous creature. This was because this creature's will and essence had already completely collapsed because Luo Fan had extracted the heat energy that had fused into its body. Now, he had been reborn from this body, a brand new creature. Of course, the body, power, and memories are the same. This makes this creature's behavior very similar to the previous creature. This creature even believes that it is the previous creature. Compared to the world as a whole, this creature has not changed much. As this peak-level expert regained complete intelligence, the other living beings also gradually regained their own intelligence. The entire world became more and more lively as the changes took place. The first batch of creatures that regained their intelligence were clearly the peak powerhouses. After all, their foundations were too solid. With such solid foundations, the speed at which they regained their intelligence was naturally faster than those with weaker foundations. In that case, it is only natural that they stood out. After these peak powerhouses gained sentience, it was easy to imagine what their choices would be. For living beings, loneliness and solitude were ultimately not pleasant feelings. When the peak powerhouses are the only ones left in the world with intelligence and can communicate with each other, this feeling of loneliness is like maggots in one's bones. Therefore, after these peak powerhouses were born, they naturally chose to nurture and teach other creatures so that they can regain their intelligence as quickly as possible. As they made their choices, the speed at which the other creatures regained their intelligence increased. As more and more creatures regained their intelligence, the identity of these peak powerhouses also changed. Unknowingly, they had already inherited the identities of those creatures who had left this world and became the ancestors of wisdom of this new world. Wisdom Ancestor is an honorific title. It means that it is the guide of wisdom and the guide of the world. This is not a title that can be obtained just by being powerful. If these peak-level experts did not guide other creatures to gain intelligence, they could only be peak-level experts no matter what. However, once they achieved this, their status would become even more transcendent, and they would receive even more respect. This series of changes lasted for hundreds of years. After coming to this world for hundreds of years, the appearance of this world has mostly returned to its original appearance. It is orderly, full of vitality, and has the potential to develop in the long run. However, the number of creatures taught by these new wisdom ancestors has unknowingly increased to the point where they can become the main body of this world and can begin to change the world as a whole. After this series of changes, the original difference between the invaders and the invaders has completely disappeared. After experiencing such a change, all of the living beings have become new living beings, and there was an intrinsic difference between them and the living beings they had been before. Under such circumstances, the relationship between all of these creatures is much closer than the relationship between them and their original bodies. In this way, the various grudges and factions of their original bodies naturally do not matter to them. Even the factions do not matter, so there is naturally no difference between the invaders and the invaders. All of them are the native creatures of this new senior sister, and they are all the masters of this world. Thus, this world has entered a stable stage of development. It can be said that from a certain point of view, Luo Fan's previous actions have made this world truly peaceful. Of course, strictly speaking, the price paid is astonishingly terrifying. It seems that the entire world does not seem to be fundamentally different from before. But in reality, the billions and trillions of creatures in this world have been erased. Naturally, Luo Fan does not care about all of this. After leaving this world, his heat incarnation had directly arrived in that new heavens and realms. As for how that world will develop, whether it will develop in a good direction or into the abyss of destruction, all of this is meaningless to him. It had been quite some time since the pinnacle experts of the new myriad heavens realms had left. After a long period of development, a new balance had been established in this new world. After all, although the pinnacle powerhouses are still controlling this place from afar. However, they were still too far away from each other. Under such circumstances, they naturally need to choose some powerhouses to manage the new world and stabilize their path of retreat. Although those selected experts were under the control of those pinnacle experts, their status was already similar to those pinnacle experts back then. Apart from that, they were already comparable to those pinnacle experts back then. And this kind of status was enough for them to seek the countless resources that existed in the new heavens and realms. Even if most of these resources need to be sent to those pinnacle powerhouses through various channels, just a little bit that is left out is enough for them to eat a full plate and greatly improve their strength. Therefore, after such a long period of development, these powerhouses have unknowingly grown to a level similar to those pinnacle powerhouses in the past. In addition, the vortex has cut off the connection between the new world and the outside world, which is equivalent to completely cutting off the pinnacle powerhouses, or in other words, the new wisdom ancestors' control over these powerhouses. In this way, these experts naturally would not foolishly play their part like before. They directly ascended to the top, and even did their best to erase all traces left behind by those peak experts in the new heavens and realms. When Luo Fan came here, it was the time when these powerhouses began to carry out this replacement operation. Faced with such a world, Luo Fan naturally didn't hesitate. The heat incarnation shook slightly in the boundless ice field, and like a black hole, it began to produce an indescribable suction force. It began to frantically attract the heat in the new world that only possessed Luo Fan's worldview. The heat separated from those worlds and began to frantically move towards where Luo Fan's heat incarnation was. It continuously integrated into it and became a part of it, becoming the source of its power. Faced with such a situation, those worlds began to tremble one after another. Fortunately, these worlds were already in a state of constant turmoil. Although the tremors affected those worlds and made them more turbulent, it was only a slight push on the foundation of the original turbulence. But it didn't cause too much panic. Otherwise, such a change alone would be enough to make those worlds fall into chaos. At this time, the powerhouses who were ascending to the top to replace the new wisdom ancestor also discovered the abnormality here. In an instant, furious consciousnesses were emitted from all directions and gushed towards where Luo Fan was. It was as if boundless waves were about to completely drown Luo Fan. For the powerhouses who had controlled a large number of resources for many years, the new world was their home field. In this home field, the strength they could display was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than in other regions. Under such circumstances, the thoughts they emitted carried endless power and even stimulated the endless chill that existed in the new heavens and realms to rush towards Luo Fan frantically. They even felt that even if those pinnacle powerhouses were in front of them, they would still be able to easily wipe them out. After using these methods, the powerhouses were relieved. Some of them even shifted their attention from Luo Fan to other places. After all, they were very busy as the new rulers of the myriad of heavens and realms. In the face of these thoughts that were wrapped in an endless chill, Luo Fan just sneered. With a slight movement of his heart, he did not even move. With just a slight surge of his aura, he had instantly destroyed all of the cold air and all of the will, causing the area around his body to be instantly covered by a mysterious fog. Moreover, the mist was still spreading in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had completely submerged the entire new heavens and myriad realms, causing the entire new heavens and myriad realms to fall into a boundless mist. Faced with such a situation, the powerhouses were all inexplicably shocked. What's going on? What is that thing? Why is it so powerful? The powerhouses asked each other with all their might. They wanted to know the origin of this existence, and even its weakness from others. However, it was a pity that these powerhouses only grew up after those pinnacle powerhouses left. Such existence's knowledge was naturally far inferior to those pinnacle powerhouses. Moreover, even if they were comparable to those pinnacle powerhouses, it wouldn't make a difference. This was because those pinnacle powerhouses didn't even know about Luo Fan's existence before they obtained the ancient books left behind by the wisdom ancestor. At this moment, Luo Fan activated it slightly, and the suction force became even stronger. The quaking of the worlds became more and more intense. Not only was the world losing the heat that was integrated into Luo Fan's worldview, but the creatures that existed in the world, and even everything that existed in the world, had begun to lose their own heat at this time. Along with this change, the thinking of those living beings began to be destroyed. All the living beings seemed to have lost their intelligence and unknowingly fell into some kind of misty state. This appearance was even more intense than the influence he had received in that world. Back then, although those living beings had lost their thinking, they still had their instincts left behind. With these instincts, all the living beings could at least survive. However, this was not the case for the living beings in this new universe. Not only did they lose their thinking, but their minds and memories had also become blank. Even their instincts had unknowingly been lost. The reason for this was actually very simple. That was because in the other world, even though those creatures had already fused with the laws and heat, they were still only halfway through their cultivation. Before the heat and the rules were integrated, those living beings were actually still living well. In this way, losing the heat and rules was equivalent to losing a flower on the brocade. Perhaps it would greatly damage the artistry of the brocade, but at the very least, the brocade was still a brocade. If the requirements were lowered, its use would not be much different from before. However, the myriad heavens and realms before him were completely different. Ever since the new universe was single, the format, Luo Fan's rules, and the heat that had integrated with his worldview had an inseparable connection with it. It could be said that the heat and the rules could almost be considered part of the foundation of this new universe and all the living beings in it. In this way, suddenly losing the heat and the rules was equivalent to removing one's internal organs and even one's brain at the same time for these living beings. It went without saying that this had a huge impact on them. The fact that these living beings were still alive, even under such influence, could already be considered to be due to the profound and unfathomable structure of the universe, which contained unimaginable vitality. How could they still hope that these living beings could still maintain their survival instincts? Devil! Devil! When the experts saw this scene, they roared in anger. They felt their hearts filled with endless resentment. Curses were constantly emitted from their mouths, turning into a surging torrent that crazily swarmed towards Luo Fan. Almost none of these powerhouses were good people. If they were good people, how could they have survived until now in this chaotic universe and climbed to their current positions? However, regardless of whether they were good people or not, they still had feelings for their own world. Chapter 2606. Highly recommended. Luo Fan naturally did not care about all of this. These countless living beings might seem perfect and realistic to them, but in his eyes, they were not much different from phantoms. If he could protect them in passing, he would not be stingy with some of his abilities. However, if the existence of these living beings blocked his path, he would never change his plan for the sake of these phantoms. Besides, perhaps for these living beings, Luo Fan's current method was fatal to them. It was to completely wipe out all the living beings in the universe. However, for Luo Fan, this was actually just giving them a different way of thinking. After all, there were still so many living beings after all. Due to these various reasons, he naturally did not care about the curses of those powerhouses at this time. At this moment, he only urged his heat incarnation to continuously absorb the countless heat that existed in the universe and integrated with the worldview of laws. More and more heat gathered, causing more and more living beings in the universe to die, causing those worlds to gradually move in the direction of death. During this process, those powerhouses struggled with all their might. Some of them even launched attacks at Luo Fan's heat incarnation despite knowing that they could not do it. They wanted to attack his heat incarnation and completely wipe out the source of the earth-shattering changes in the universe. Of course, this kind of attack was naturally nothing to Luo Fan. He didn't even need to take any action. Just by relying on his own body, he was able to completely block these attacks, causing these attacks to completely shatter the moment they hit him. However, they did not affect him in the slightest. In fact, there was no delay in the absorption of the heat of the universe. His absorption of the heat was still the same as before, and it did not slow down at all because of their resistance. Since this method could not succeed, those powerhouses could only choose another method in despair. That was to work hard to protect and stabilize their own worlds. However, it was a pity that compared to directly attacking Luo Fan, resisting Luo Fan was a more direct choice to protect the heat of their own worlds, but the effect was also smaller. There was no other reason. It was because they simply could not understand how Luo Fan was extracting the heat of the countless worlds in the universe. The current changes in the heat were simply as if they were originally connected to Luo Fan's body and mind. but now they were directly transmitted to Luo Fan's heat incarnation through this mysterious connection. How could these experts, who were merely roaming around in the new heavens and realms, discover such an incomparably mysterious connection? In the end, even though they had worked so hard, exhausted almost all of their power, and used up all the resources they had collected in the universe, they could only watch as the heat constantly left their worlds and converged towards the heat incarnation in the universe. In the end, it completely disappeared without a trace. This kind of effort was completed in just a few dozen days. The reason was naturally not because these powerhouses were in complete despair, gave up everything, and planned to watch the entire world die. Instead, it was because these powerhouses themselves had lost the ability to think because they had lost the heat. Without the ability to think, they did not even know fear, so how could they resist the heat absorption that Luo Fan had exerted? In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. Just like before, he continued to draw and absorb the countless amounts of heat that existed between the heavens and realms. This process unknowingly lasted for a few months. Finally, almost all the heat in the universe had been completely condensed on Luo Fan's heat incarnation. At this moment, the heat incarnation seemed to have condensed a little more than before. In fact, a restrained charm appeared on the heat incarnation, causing the incarnation to seem more compatible with the surrounding ice and become more harmonious. There's only one left. At this moment, Luo Fan nailed his wooden pipe to the last mountain that existed in a certain world. This mountain was the only thing in the universe that he had not absorbed heat yet. As long as he completely extracted the heat energy that had fused with the nomological worldview, all the worlds in the entire heavens and realms would no longer be contaminated by any of his laws or heat energy. It could be said that at this point, he could already be considered to have victory in sight. As the heat in the universe decreased more and more, the branch that extended from the source of the cold law and was contaminated with Luo Fan's law aura began to undergo an inexplicable change. Just like roots that had their moisture sucked away, the entire branch began to wither throughout the entire process. This kind of shrinkage caused the branch vein to become faintly discernible. It was as if it was about to completely disappear and be severed. Seeing this situation, Luo Fan had his own guesses in his heart. His decision to extract the heat energy from the heavens and realms became firmer and firmer. As long as I extract this, it should be cut off. This thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, the thing that he was referring to was naturally the last mountain that existed in the universe that had integrated with the worldview of laws. And that was, of course, that branch. As he abruptly increased his strength, the mountain trembled slightly before completely collapsing. It turned into a wave of heat that charged into the sky. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived outside the world, and it was crazily thrown towards the gigantic incarnation of Luo Fan, who was in the midst of all the worlds in the universe. At this moment, the branch made creaking sounds, and countless tiny cracks appeared on the branch, instantly spreading from the source to the end. The entire branch seemed to be wrapped in endless cracks, as if the entire branch was glued together by these tiny fragments. Did I guess wrong? At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, a sigh sounded from below. "Fellow Taoist, why do you have to be so ruthless?" As he spoke, an indescribable chill rushed up from below. In the blink of an eye, it had already pierced through the entire branch meridian that had almost collapsed, instantly healing the countless cracks on the branch meridian. In just a few short breaths, the entire branch meridian had already completely recovered to its original, extremely perfect state. In other words, the branch was in a state without any damage or atrophy. At that moment, Luo Fan only felt an incomparably terrifying aura rushing up from below, making him feel as if he was directly facing the will of heaven and earth. As expected, there is some kind of existence controlling all of this behind the scenes. At this moment, how could Luo Fan not understand that the faint guess in his heart was true? Originally, the reason why he was so determined, even if it meant letting all the living beings in the old and new universes die once, was because deep in his heart, he had an extraordinary rejection of this evolution that did not come from his own will. Before this, he actually did not know the source of this rejection in his heart. He only felt that he could not let these two universes continue to evolve. However, when he saw that the branch continued to shrink as the heat was extracted, he actually vaguely understood the reason for his unusual rejection. In other words, he had a vague feeling that the being that drew out his rules and heat to construct the new worlds and the countless beings might not be this world itself, or even the origin of the cold rule. Instead, it might be something else, a powerful being that was essentially a living being. The reason for this judgment was actually very simple. According to the current relationship between the branch vein and the heat, the appearance of the branch vein itself was an incomprehensible phenomenon. The branch was linked to the heat, and when the heat was extracted, the branch would shrink and even collapse. In that case, how did this branch appear when the heat did not exist? If there was no heat, according to the current situation, the branch should not have existed at all. With this thought, it was natural that the branch should have appeared in the beginning due to some kind of external force. It was self-evident what external force meant to Luo Fan, who currently existed alone in the depths of the ice field. It was precisely because of this that he was certain that other similar living beings existed in this ice field. Perhaps they were above, perhaps they were below, perhaps they were in the depths, or perhaps they were simply in the source of the cold rules. Kill them all. When you schemed against me, you probably didn't think about my reaction, right? Luo Fan said indifferently. At this moment, his main body had already opened his eyes. His perception covered the entire ice field, searching for any abnormalities that might exist in the entire ice field. Of course, his focus was on the source of the voice below. Fellow Taoist, you've misunderstood. Why have I schemed against you? I'm only carrying out my own cultivation. The voice sounded extremely innocent at this moment. Its tone was as innocent as it could be. Luo Fan snorted disdainfully at this attitude and said, "My own cultivation? I think it's devouring. There are so many branches here. It seems that many cultivators who came here to cultivate were devoured by you." The voice paused for a moment before continuing. Fellow Taoist, you've really misunderstood me too much. However, it's fine. As long as there's enough, we'll meet again. Fellow Taoist, you'll definitely be able to see my true colors. Trying to act mysterious. At this moment, Luo Fan snorted coldly. As he said that, his heat clone abruptly raised his hand and grabbed the air, grabbing the branch meridian that was tainted with his rules, or rather his aura. As he grabbed the vein, he instantly felt an endless chill being stimulated from the vein and pouring into the body of his heat incarnation. Zzzzz. At this moment, strange sounds continuously erupted from the point of contact between the cold and heat. Wisps of smoke continuously dispersed in all directions, causing his body to constantly tremble during this process. What a powerful cold law. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This cold law almost surpassed the entire ice field and even the source of the cold law, where his main body was located. As soon as it entered his body, it began to wreak havoc in his body and assimilate the heat inside his body, causing more and more damage to his body during this process. At this moment, all the heat inside his heat clone seemed to have become ordinary heat and began to retreat without any ability to resist. It could be said that this chill alone was already at the level of a pseudo-sage. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression became extremely solemn. His heat incarnation trembled slightly at this moment and suddenly fused with some incomparably powerful existence. His body turned into a state between existence and non-existence, allowing the cold air to pass through his body and not affect him in the slightest. Immediately afterwards, the heat clone became solid again. Its body trembled, and as the heat surged, it erupted with indescribable power. Along with this kind of power, the entire branch vein began to violently tremble. Something that existed within it began to break away from the branch vein. Like rivers flowing into the sea, it began to quickly converge at the end of the branch vein, where Luo Fan's heat incarnation was. This was none other than the heat that came from the combination of the law worldview. The heat on this branch was naturally insignificant compared to the heat in the various worlds. In fact, it was much less than the heat in any of the worlds. However, the law worldview contained in the heat on this branch was thousands of times more than the heat contained in any of the worlds in the various worlds. Chapter 26:07. You can actually seize my power. A soft exclamation came from below. At this moment, the branch meridian had completely changed its appearance. The aura of Luo Fan that originally existed had completely disappeared. The entire branch meridian was left with pure and chilly laws. It was as if a certain accessory that had originally integrated into the branch meridian had been removed. In contrast, Luo Fan's heat incarnation had unknowingly been surrounded by faint clouds and mist. These clouds and mist appeared around his body like thin gauze, and they interacted with the endless chilly aura around him in various indescribable ways. During this interaction, either the chilly aura or the heat was eliminated, and the two formed an extremely subtle dynamic balance system. Under this balanced system, Luo Fan's heat incarnation seemed to transcend everything. Although it was in the ice field, it seemed to be unaffected by it. Your Excellency, you may have stayed in this world for too long and forgotten what the path of cultivation represents for existences like us, Luo Fan said faintly. The reason why he was able to directly extract the aura of his worldview from the branch meridian and turn it into his own was actually because the worldview was the focus of Luo Fan's cultivation. Because it was the focus of cultivation, his connection with the worldview was much closer than ordinary cultivators could imagine. In fact, even the relationship between the path of cultivation and the cultivator who created the path of cultivation was not as close as this relationship. Under such circumstances, even if the other party only borrowed his view of the world to construct this heat that carried his aura, the nature was actually not much different from directly extracting Luo Fan's power to construct this kind of branch meridian. With such convenience, it could not be more normal for Luo Fan to be able to extract all the heat in the branch meridian just now. Of course, strictly speaking, Luo Fan's statement was not correct either. The existence had actually considered the wonderful connection between existences of their level and their own path of cultivation. When constructing the branch meridian, the other party had obviously avoided directly copying the path of cultivation as much as possible. What was used in the branch meridian was merely borrowing some worldview. If Luo Fan was really an ordinary cultivator, he would definitely not be able to seize the heat in the branch meridian that carried his aura. To be able to reach this stage by going against the flow, fellow Taoist ability is truly admirable. The voice from below sounded again. At this moment, the eyes of Luo Fan's main body narrowed. An endless heat suddenly seeped out of his body. The heat was like countless long rivers that gushed out of his body and frantically impacted the source of the cold laws around him. The source of the cold law itself was an existence that surpassed power and heat. If it was ordinary heat, it wouldn't be able to withstand the cold law source in an instant. It would be completely crushed by the cold law source and turned into nothingness. However, the heat that Luo Fan exuded was obviously not ordinary heat. After years of polishing, the heat had integrated with the worldview of laws 100 times deeper than before. At this moment, it was not far from the materialization of the worldview of laws. Under such circumstances, the heat was already barely able to resist the source of the cold laws around him. At the very least, it would not be completely erased by the source of the cold laws right away. Instead, it could have a significant effect on the source of the cold laws, causing the surrounding source of the cold laws to collapse under the impact of the heat rivers. Following this collapsing effect, the entire source of the cold laws began to shake violently. Some kind of existence that was originally hidden in the depths of the source of the cold laws finally, gradually revealed itself. An indescribable light and shadow was gradually revealed in the depths of the source of the cold laws. These light and shadow were blurry and indistinct. Even their forms were extremely unstable and did not stabilize for even a moment. However, just by looking at the light and shadow, Luo Fan knew that his guess just now was correct. It was a world, or rather, a world of its own. A world that was artificially created in the outside world, or in other words, outside of this place of fortuitous encounters. It was extremely common for people to create a world by themselves. It was even to the extent that even Khanate Grand Luo realm cultivators could easily create a world by themselves as long as they spent enough time and used sufficient techniques. However, that was only outside of this world. In this world, it was an extremely shocking thing to be able to achieve this. This was because this world rejected all extraordinary abilities. No extraordinary ability could be materialized in this world. Even if it was an existence like Luo Fan, who had bypassed this restriction through some means, the extraordinary ability that he could display would be greatly reduced. However, under such circumstances, there was actually an existence that could use such an extremely restricted extraordinary ability, or even without any extraordinary ability, to create a world of its own. What kind of unbelievable achievement was that? How could he not be shocked and even horrified? What kind of existence is this? How long has it been in this world? How could it do such a thing? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. However, although this thought flashed across his mind, he had no intention of stopping. At this moment, when the blurry light and shadow of the world appeared, he had already controlled the numerous streams of heat that gushed out of his body to change direction. He withstood the crushing and strangling of the boundless source of cold laws around him and began to rush towards the light and shadow of the world. Ka-ka-ka-ka-ka. Terrifying sounds came from all directions at this moment. Although the source of cold laws was the source of laws and not a real entity, as the source of laws, it had already surpassed a physical entity. Not only did it possess some of the qualities of a physical entity, but it also possessed qualities that countless physical entities did not. At this moment, under the impact of the torrent of heat, the source of cold laws was indeed constantly strangling and crushing the torrent of heat released by Luo Fan. However, at the same time, the torrent of heat was also causing all sorts of indescribable damage to the source of cold laws. Amidst this damage, the source of cold laws kept collapsing and breaking. As a result, all sorts of sounds began to come out from it. At this moment, a cold snort came from the light and shadow of the world. Along with this cold snort, a palm brazenly rushed out of the silhouette, opened and grasped. The torrent of heat emitted by Luo Fan, as if rivers flowing into the sea, began to converge towards the center of the palm. It was as if all other directions had been completely cut off by this palm, and this was the only way out that could be chosen. Just from this palm alone, Luo Fan knew that the strength that this existence could exert was at least at the false sage level. Compared to Luo Fan's true strength, this kind of strength was naturally insignificant. It was not even qualified to stand firmly in front of him, nor was it qualified to withstand his will. However, at this moment, in this world, such strength was already enough to easily crush the current Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan could clearly see the changes on the palm, all the laws, all the principles, and even the essence of it, he could not avoid this palm no matter what. He could only watch as the palm forcibly grabbed the torrent of heat released by him. The reason for this was naturally because the strength that Luo Fan could exert at this moment was still inferior to the other party. The reason for this was naturally because the strength that Luo Fan could exert at this moment was ultimately inferior to the other party. Even though he had already made a lot of progress, even though the heat that he could control in his body had almost sublimated to the extent of turning into the materialization of the world of laws, the strength brought by his physical body and heat was ultimately only below the false sage level. Even if this was below the false sage level, it was already at the rank 9 false sage level. Compared to a false sage, there was still an intrinsic difference Moreover, apart from this, the essence of that creature was clearly far superior to that of a false sage. In the hands of the other party, the effect that this false sage level strength could exert was actually far superior to that of a false sage level. Luo Fan's efficiency in using power might be higher than the other parties, but it was not high enough for him to directly cross the gap between a false sage and a false sage. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan could only watch helplessly as the other party stretched out a palm that seemed to be made of ice turned into a black hole, directly sucking the torrent of heat released by him into the palm, grabbing it, and starting to crush it. You actually managed to force me out. It seems that you're very different from those fellow Taoists from before. At this moment, the owner of the palm said, I didn't expect such a powerhouse like you to be hidden in this seemingly uninhabited place. Luo Fan's expression was extremely solemn at this moment. At this moment, the indistinct, and blurry world had completely stabilized. At a glance, this world was an extremely perfect world. At a glance, there was nothing missing in the entire world. At a glance, it was like a planet floating in the depths of the source of the cold laws, rotating slowly and exchanging laws with the source of the cold laws and the surroundings at all times. It looked as if it was constantly inhaling and exhaling the cold law source. At this moment, a figure gradually emerged from the world. It was an Iceman. At least, its general outline was that of a human. Of course, the specific details were still fundamentally different from the innate Taoist aptitude that Luo Fan knew. At first glance, it would seem like an extremely strange monster. However, this was obviously only the result at first glance. If one took a closer look, they would realize that this figure was not a monster at all. Even though the structure of its body was fundamentally different from the innate Taoist aptitude that Luo Fan knew, it was still an extremely perfect form, as if it vaguely conformed to some indescribable principle. For Luo Fan, who was considered knowledgeable, this kind of characteristic was naturally able to tell at a glance that this was another perfect world, or rather, the appearance of the innate Taoist aptitude of another world. Perhaps, in the eyes of the other party, the innate Taoist aptitude that he thought was perfect was also a strange monster. The body of this Iceman seemed to have grown out of the cold world, and the palm that he had stretched out previously was completely grown on his arm without any gaps at all. It felt as if he had really stretched out his palm to deal with the heat torrent that Luo Fan had sent out. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. Incarnation? The figure shook slightly, and there was a look of surprise in his eyes as he said, You can actually tell. Hearing him admit it, Luo Fan could not help but be shocked. He had guessed that the other party was an incarnation and not his real body just now, because the other party's degree of integration with the source of the cold laws around him was beyond imagination, as if he had grown out of the source of the cold laws. After all, an existence that could come to this world to search for opportunities did not seem like an existence that would set up shackles for himself, no matter how he looked at it. This kind of complete integration with the source of the cold laws, no matter how he looked at it, was setting up shackles for himself and was looking for trouble for himself. If it had been Luo Fan himself, he would definitely not have been willing to let his real body do this. If he had to do this, he would at most leave an incarnation here. This was the reason why he made such a judgment. However, the existence did not know that Luo Fan had only made this deduction by putting himself in his shoes, and thought that his eyesight had already reached such a level. Facing Luo Fan, he could not help but become much more serious, and the originally lazy aura on his body had unknowingly reduced to a point where it was almost non-existent. It seems that I've still underestimated you. I didn't expect you to have such eyesight, given the strength that you can use now, to be able to see that I'm just an incarnation. As he said this, the aura on his body began to swell, faintly producing a powerful deterrent that gradually pressed down on Luo Fan. Chapter 26:08. Just the incarnation alone was already so powerful, so how terrifying would the true body of that existence be? More importantly, facing this incarnation, he did not have much confidence in defeating it. At most, he had some confidence in protecting himself. Under such circumstances, how could he not feel helpless? How could he not sigh? As for Luo Fan's self-confidence that he had the confidence to protect himself, whether it was arrogance or self-confidence, it was certainly not. Although the strength that he could display in this world was only at the peak of the pseudo-saint realm, his essence was that of a sixth tribulation powerhouse. With such an essence, not to mention the fact that his opponent's incarnation could only display the attack of the pseudo-saint technique, even the attack of a fourth or fifth tribulation powerhouse might not be able to do anything to him. Under such circumstances, no matter how strong the enemy's attack was, it would only be able to defeat him. It was absolutely impossible for it to kill him, of course, if the situation really reached a point where he was completely defeated and had no hope of survival at all with the strength he had displayed. Even if his life was not in danger and the essence of his life still existed, the punishment from this world would definitely be so great that he could no longer cultivate in this world. At that time, Luo Fan would probably have to use the method that he had previously deduced to leave this world and return to the path of a Tao sovereign. Such an outcome was obviously not what he wanted to see. Therefore, even if he knew that his life would not be in danger, he would never give up resisting. At that moment, he only said indifferently, "You want to use this method to deal with me? Your Excellency must be dreaming." As he spoke, the heat on his body surged, and indescribable explosions appeared around him. The source of the cold laws around him seemed to have been detonated at that moment, mixing and stacking together and frantically pushing in all directions. Cold mist seemed to have appeared around him out of thin air, and it began to spread in all directions along with the explosions. This change instantly intercepted the powerful aura of the ice creature. The aura itself had all sorts of incredible effects. At this moment, when it collided with the explosions, crackling like countless lightning bolts exploding. Facing this situation, the ice creature only smiled and said, "Why must you resist like this? You know that we can't die in this world no matter what. Even if the worst result is, we'll only be silent for a period of time. Resisting like this is making a mountain out of a molehill." However, Luo Fan's expression did not change in the slightest. At this moment, all he could use was the heat energy condensed in his body, which had already merged with his worldview of laws. It was almost a manifestation of the worldview of laws. The power of this heat was considerable, and it was even enough to affect the source of the cold rule in the surroundings. However, in the end, it was just heat. With Luo Fan's means, he could use this kind of heat to display all kinds of incredible, extraordinary abilities, making him seemingly omnipotent. However, in a real battle, heat was still heat. In the end, its true destructive power was still pushing the essence of heat to the limit. Under such circumstances, relying on this heat to fight was ultimately not as unrestricted as his original method. It was just that it was more abundant and could be used as he pleased. At this moment, with a slight thought, the heat incarnation outside the source of the cold rule flashed and appeared in the source of the cold rule. It appeared next to his real body. After arriving here, the heat incarnation grabbed and shook, as if it had directly grabbed a physical object. It grabbed the aura of the ice creature. At this moment, the ice creature reacted. It completely disregarded its own aura and reached out to grab at Luo Fan's heat incarnation. The power of this grab was earth-shattering. In the blink of an eye, its palm had already penetrated the void and turned into a massive object. It appeared directly in front of Luo Fan's heat incarnation and produced an incredible suction force that started sucking at Luo Fan's heat incarnation frantically. It wanted to strip away the heat from its body and absorb it into the palm. In the face of such a method, Luo Fan's heat incarnation did not move. Instead, his real body had already rushed out of the surrounding cold mist in a flash and rapidly charged towards the ice creature. In the blink of an eye, his real body had already arrived in front of the ice creature. A large mass of heat transformed into thousands or tens of thousands of forms in the void. With the support of Luo Fan's real body's fist, it violently blasted towards the ice creature. If this blast had happened outside, even in this part of the world, it would have been enough to completely shatter the void within a radius of 100,000 miles and ignite the surrounding origin energy of the heaven and earth. However, in this place, in the depths of the origin of the cold rules, this punch only caused ripples after ripples in the surroundings. As for the void shattering or the origin energy of the heaven and earth being ignited, there was nothing. In the face of such a punch, the ice creature remained unfazed. In just a flash, his other palm had already appeared in front of Luo Fan's fist and clenched it at once. Such a punch was nothing to Luo Fan. In terms of speed and technique alone, given Luo Fan's strength, he could even think of tens of thousands of ways to avoid this grip. He could even take advantage of this grip to attack the ice creature. Unfortunately, at this moment, there was an incredible suction force on the palm that was completely focused on heat. This suction force was so strong that even Luo Fan felt that the heat circulation system in his body was affected and being indirectly controlled. The heat wrapped around his fist seemed to be grabbed by an invisible hand at this moment. It could not move as he had previously thought. Instead, it started to leave his fist on its own. It broke away from the main body of the heat and rushed towards the ice creature's palm. This kind of change instantly disrupted Luo Fan's original plan, causing him to be unable to carry out any of the responses that he could easily make. He could only watch helplessly as his fist was abruptly caught by that palm. Immediately afterward, an incredible suction force appeared on the palm of Luo Fan's hand and began to crazily absorb the heat on Luo Fan's fist. It even began to absorb the heat inside the internal heat circulation system of his body, causing the endless heat to crazily pour into the palm of his hand and disappear without a trace. Luo Fan frowned at this moment. He could feel that after his heat entered the other party's palm, it was quickly neutralized by some kind of chill. Even the worldview that belonged to his laws contained within it was completely erased and eliminated in the process. After the entire change, he could no longer find the heat. It was as if the heat had completely left him. It's not seizing, but annihilating at the same time. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. He already understood how the ice creature dealt with the heat that it absorbed into its body. The heat was obviously very different from the essence of the creature. It could even be said that it was a completely opposite existence. As a result, after the creature absorbed the heat energy, it did not use the heat energy as it had expected. In fact, it did not even store the heat energy. Instead, it directly neutralized the chill in his body with the heat, causing both to be annihilated at the same time. It could be said that during this process, not only was Luo Fan losing his own heat, but the other party was also losing the existence that was similar to the chill. This could even be said to be a lose-lose situation. Of course, if the current environment was taken into account, Luo Fan would obviously suffer a great loss. After all, this was the source of the law of cold. In such a place, the ice creature could clearly absorb the endless chill in the surroundings at all times, and even absorb the endless laws in the surroundings. In this way, even if it didn't dare to say that it could replenish as much as it lost, it could at least obtain a considerable amount of replenishment from the source of the law of cold around it. This replenishment was enough to allow it to last longer in this mutual destruction situation. In fact, it could even last until Luo Fan completely failed at this moment. Luo Fan's heat clone had already disappeared in front of the ice creature's palm in a flash. Although the heat clone's entire structure was made up of heat, and it didn't even have a physical body to support it. However, compared to his fleshly body, his time had actually increased his agility and freedom. Although he was also affected by the suction force from the palm, he only gave up a little bit of his own heat and escaped before the suction force could affect his main body. Just like that, he easily avoided the suction force from the palm. His body easily crossed the origin of the law of ice and arrived at the extreme depths where the ice creature stood. In other words, it was the location of the world that was like a sphere of ice. After arriving here, Luo Fan's heat clone condensed a long whip without hesitation and fiercely swung it at the world. The long whip was not simple. Although it was condensed from heat, its quality was so high that it almost surpassed all physical materials. If it was swung in an ordinary world, it would probably be enough to split time and space. If it landed on the ground, it might even split the entire continent in half and turn it into two continents. Although the world in front of him looked extremely profound, its size, at least from the outside, was ultimately only a few hundred feet in diameter. Compared to the long whip thrown by Luo Fan's heat clone, such a sphere could really be considered insignificant. With such power, if the long whip really swung at the world without holding back, what awaited the world would at least be directly split in half. If it was more serious, it wouldn't be unbelievable for the entire world to be directly shattered and turned into endless powder. Facing such a whip, the ice creature's expression changed. Then, with a turn of his body, he arrived at the side of Luo Fan's heat incarnation and fiercely slammed into it. This collision actually gave off a feeling as if countless heavens and earth had converged together and collided fiercely. At this moment, Luo Fan's heat clone felt like it was being rejected by countless worlds, as if it was about to be crushed by them in the next moment. The power of this collision would probably be enough to shatter an entire continent if it were outside. Although the impact of this collision was greatly weakened in the source of the law of cold, if it really collided with the heat clone structure, it could be expected that it would be completely smashed and destroyed. Facing such a change, Luo Fan's heat clone smiled faintly and said, "Looks like I've grasped your weakness." At this moment, he didn't care about his own body at all. Instead, he swung the whip with even more force towards the sky and earth. Seeing that Luo Fan's heat clone didn't care about him, the ice creature's expression finally changed drastically. He had originally planned to force Luo Fan's heat clone to withdraw the long whip to protect himself. That way, he would also be able to resolve his own world's siege. However, he hadn't expected that the heat clone would actually throw caution to the wind and completely disregard the danger he would encounter. He would rather die than attack that part of the world. That's right, he's just a clone. His real body is still there. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration. As soon as he thought of this, how could he dare to be negligent? Without any visible movement, his palm had already appeared at the head of the long whip and grabbed at it. Puff! With a soft sound, the long whip completely shattered his palm, making it impossible for him to find it for a long time. Clearly, although the palm was fast and powerful, it was still far inferior to the long whip. At this moment, facing the long whip, although it was fast enough to grab the long whip, it ultimately couldn't resist its power. Under the long whip, it was completely obliterated. Even so, the ice creature wasn't disappointed. This was because although the long whip had obliterated his palm, the long whip was still slightly delayed at this moment. This slight delay was something that ordinary creatures would not even have time to think about. However, to this ice creature, this slight delay was enough to change the situation. Chapter 26:09. The long whip streaked past the sky and earth, but did not come into contact with the sky and earth. It did not actually touch the sky and earth. However, just by streaking past like that, the sky and earth seemed to have been slapped by a huge hand. The side closest to the whip suddenly caved in, and a powerful rebound force sent it flying in another direction. Boom, 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 boom. In that instant, whether it was the source of the cold laws or the sky and earth itself, an extremely loud rumble was produced. The rumble of the source of the cold laws was only due to the sudden movement of the sphere, which caused the cold laws to fluctuate. For the source of the cold laws, this kind of change did not affect the stability of the entire source of the cold laws. However, compared to the sky and earth, this change was huge. In that instant, everything in the sky and earth had been deformed. All the space-time in the entire sky and earth suffered an unbelievable impact from the strong wind brought by the long whip. Space shattered, time was severed, everything collapsed, laws were destroyed, and all living beings were withering away. All of these scenes were even more tragic than the end of the world. The expression of the ice creature became extremely ugly at that instant, and the powerful aura on its body, which had originally been flawless, instantly became chaotic. The terrifying pressure that had been exerting on Luo Fan ever since it had appeared had instantly weakened by countless times. The terrifying suction force that had been blocking his body and targeting the boundless heat in his body had also made countless mistakes in that instant. These omissions might not matter to ordinary living beings. However, for Luo Fan, even the slightest mistake would be grasped tightly by Luo Fan, and he could directly reverse the situation, let alone so many mistakes. Immediately, his body trembled, and the heat in his body instantly underwent various subtle changes that could not be described with words. Amidst these changes, a powerful repulsive force erupted from his heat. In an extremely mysterious way, it acted on the mysterious suction force from the ice creature's palm, causing the suction force to lose its force. As it lost its force, Luo Fan felt his body become empty, and the suction force that had been tightly pulling him had disappeared without a trace. At that moment, his entire body had regained control, and he had regained his ease. The ice creature's expression changed drastically. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had already escaped from the suction force, revealed a faint smile on his face. With a sway of his body, he had already passed through the ice creature and rushed towards the area that was protected by the ice creature. Clearly, he was certain that to this ice creature, attacking his body was far inferior to directly attacking that world. This ice creature was only the avatar of a cultivator. Even if it was destroyed, it wouldn't cause much damage to the creature, and it wouldn't be enough to let the creature know how determined it was. However, the situation would be different if he were to attack that part of the world. Compared to the ease of obtaining an incarnation, this heaven and earth was much rarer and more important. It was even possible that the origin of this ice creature's incarnation came from that world. If this wasn't the case, the ice creature wouldn't have been affected so greatly after the world was attacked, causing its body and power to show flaws. The ice creature's expression changed drastically, and it roared, "How dare you!" With this roar, it did not hesitate to turn around and pounce towards Luo Fan. Although there were flaws in its body, it still had power. Just based on power alone, it still had quite a bit of an advantage over Luo Fan. Thus, although Luo Fan had set off first and his target was extremely clear, the ice creature had already rushed near him before he reached that world. Endless cold air turned into countless chains from all directions and began to wrap around Luo Fan. It looked like it was about to wrap around him and completely seal him up. If this creature was perfect and flawless, Luo Fan would have to use an even more powerful and incredible power to resist these chains. Only then would he be able to resist these chains. However, this creature was currently full of flaws. Although this encirclement was not full of holes like a sieve, there were too many holes. Under such circumstances, in the face of such an attack, Luo Fan's expression only slightly froze. His figure flickered in the endless and mysterious trajectory of each swing. Then, his figure had unknowingly rushed out of the encirclement and directly arrived in front of the sky. After arriving, he smiled faintly. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. Countless heat blades appeared in front of him. After these heat blades appeared, they naturally exuded a strong aura that belonged to the world of laws. This kind of aura was incompatible with the surrounding cold law source. It was faintly repelled by the surrounding cold law source, emitting a strange, sizzling sound. One could even see the surface of the heat blades rapidly melting away. Faced with this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. There was an indescribable joy on his face as he raised his hand and pressed down. As he pressed down, the countless sharp blades pierced straight into the world that was still changing shape and seemed to have yet to fully recover from the previous impact. Chi. A powerful impact was quickly produced in that world, and the space-time in that world became increasingly chaotic. After the countless sharp blades pierced the world, They seemed to have turned into countless terrifying demons that began to wreak havoc, slaughter, and annihilate the world. Stop! At this moment, the ice creature roared and quickly rushed towards Luo Fan's body. The unshackled chains formed by the countless cold law sources that he controlled were like poisonous dragons. They streaked across a marvelous trajectory that was hard to describe with words. They were wrapped in countless unimaginable laws and contained unimaginable power as they rushed towards Luo Fan's body with incomparable agility. If an ordinary creature was faced with such an attack, they would probably be skewered by the chains immediately. However, it was clear that Luo Fan was the one with the strength. He was an existence that was at the pinnacle of the sixth tribulation. For such a being, the power that he could unleash at the pinnacle of the false holiness stage at this moment had already reached a certain level of perfection. This kind of attack, which was extremely terrifying and almost impossible to resist in the eyes of ordinary creatures, was just a broken net in his eyes. It was even easier for him to resist it than when he faced the attacks of the countless chains. With a flicker of his figure, he easily deflected the countless dragon-like chains. The fundamental reason for this was naturally because the heat blades that Luo Fan had emitted were destroying the world at this moment. The foundation of this ice creature was clearly that world. The source of his existence was that part of the world. Under such circumstances, as long as there were any changes in that part of the world, it would have a huge impact on him. At this moment, this region had already fallen into chaos, which had naturally caused the entire world to fall into chaos for that life form. The result of this chaos was that there were all sorts of flaws that he couldn't control. For Luo Fan, this kind of flaw was something that he could make use of. Naturally, he could easily dodge all of the ice creature's attacks. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that his target was that world and not the ice creature itself, perhaps just these flaws alone would have been enough for Luo Fan to easily get rid of the ice creature. At this moment, the tremors of the entire ice field became more and more intense. The new world that was born in the turmoil and had already adapted to the turmoil couldn't bear the further turmoil, so it directly fell into the fate of the old world. The world continued to collapse, and all life continued to die. If there were no other movements, then it would only be a matter of time before the entire world was destroyed. However, this change didn't cause too much fear for the living beings in the new world. It could even be said that it didn't cause any fear at all, because of Luo Fan's previous action of drawing away the heat, all the creatures in this new universe had already lost their ability to think, and they had lost their instinct to fear. Under such circumstances, they wouldn't feel the slightest fear even if they were directly destroyed. Not to mention that the world was being destroyed one by one, which was something extremely distant to them. From a certain point of view, Luo Fan's action of removing the heat had prevented them from facing the end of the world. It couldn't be said to be a great deed, but it could be considered a good deed, of course, if one were to insist that these living beings would definitely be able to think of a way to deal with the changes in the new world if they were awake. Then one would be overthinking things. The reason why the wisdom ancestors were able to fuse the myriad heavens and realms together was because of their special status in the old myriad heavens and realms. The powerhouses that grew up in the new world were not the wisdom ancestors. They didn't have the strength of the wisdom ancestors, nor did they have the wisdom. The things that the wisdom ancestor could do, they couldn't do. Looking from outside the ice field, the entire ice field looked like the surface of the sea in a storm. The originally sparkling surface surged with waves, and the ice was pushed out of the ice field, forming ice waves that were thousands of miles high. Then, in the next moment, they were sucked into the ice field by a strange suction force, causing deep valleys to appear there, and ice waves to appear in other places. The cycle repeated like this, making it hard for people to believe that this was an ice field, let alone that there was ice in it. La 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 la. Boom, 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 boom. Crack, crack, crack. Z, 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 z. G, 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 g. All kinds of strange sounds kept coming from the ice field. Some of them were the sounds of collisions. Some were the sounds of explosions. Some were the sounds of ice rubbing against each other. And some were the strange sounds of air being compressed. All sorts of noises spread out at this moment. causing the ice field to lose its original tranquility. How vast was the entire ice field? It was a vast area that had to be calculated in billions of miles. In such a vast area, such huge movements were happening at every moment and every inch. It was easy to imagine how great the commotion was when all of them converged together. The area within billions of miles around the ice field felt the terrifying tremors of the ice field at this moment and heard all kinds of incredible sounds coming from it. Amidst these sounds, all living beings began to panic. Countless living beings began to flee in all directions out of fear. It was as if an inconceivable disaster had suddenly appeared around the ice plains, and wave after wave of beast tides were produced. Given the scale of the tremors in the ice field, it was naturally impossible for the ground to not be affected at all. Whether it was the ground in the depths of the ice field, the ground around the ice field, or even the mountains, all of them began to shake violently due to the movements of the ice field. It was as if an invisible hand was grabbing the ground and causing it to shake continuously. This kind of movement increased the panic of all living beings, causing them to flee even faster and even more determined. As they fled, some living beings began to go against the tide and began to rush in the direction of the ice field. They were extremely cautious and careful, and there was indescribable greed in their eyes. In the process of rushing over, they did their best to avoid the beast tides that were fleeing. Of course, this was very difficult, but the area affected by the movements of the ice field was extremely large after all. Even though there were waves of beasts like this, they only occupied a very small area in this vast area. If they wanted to search, they would eventually be able to find a direction that was not drowned by the beast tides. As a result, although it was troublesome, the advance of these creatures was only slightly delayed. In the end, they still did not cause much trouble. They arrived near the ice field and looked at the ice field that had turned into a violent sea from the void. NT. Chapter 2610. Every single one of these beings had extraordinary abilities, and they were all cultivators that were different from beasts. Moreover, it was extremely likely that they were the cultivators that had entered this world in search of fortuitous encounters. I can sense that my laws are dissipating. One of the beings with 18 arms and 8 eyes said plainly. The language used by this creature was an extremely unfamiliar one. However, when it came from his mouth, almost every living being could understand what he was trying to express, even the beings that did not seem to have any intelligence. The other living beings were not surprised by this being's words at all. Instead, all of them appeared to be quite calm. It was evident that they were not surprised at all that the other beings had appeared here. I have the same feeling. Another being that seemed to be a ball of air that was constantly changing said. The language he spoke was also a completely unfamiliar one. However, at the same time, any existence would be able to understand what he wanted to express, whether they had intelligence or not, and whether they understood this language or not. The other living beings also indicated that their laws were already dissipating. When everyone's feelings were unified, a sense of excitement appeared on every living being's body. I've been waiting for this moment. I've endured the punishment of this world and dragged it on just for this moment. The being with 18 arms and 8 eyes said. His 8 eyes shone with an indescribable chill. Back then, we were all schemed against by that person in this icy plain, having no choice but to become dead people in the eyes of this world. Until now, it has already been as long as 70 million years, right? Another creature said. His voice was filled with vicissitudes, anger, and indescribable hatred. 73. 2 million years, another cultivator said. As he spoke, his emotions surged and seemed to turn into raging flames that started to burn the space around him. Back then, there were hundreds of people who were schemed against. In the end, only the 17 of us are still here. Now, the longest we've waited is at least 10 trillion years, and the shortest is at least 70 million years. Today, our plan can finally be implemented, the being continued. As he spoke, a determination to take revenge emanated from his body. The other cultivators all revealed looks of determination. It was as if the hatred that had been suppressed in their hearts for tens of thousands of years had finally erupted at this moment. If Luo Fan could see these cultivators at this moment, he would know that the auras emitted from these cultivators were extremely similar to one of the many branches that came from the origin of the cold laws in the depths of the ice plains. It was almost as if they had the same origin, the same characteristics. It was obvious that these cultivators were most likely the same as Luo Fan. They were beings that had been schemed against by the icy being. However, compared to Luo Fan, who reacted instinctively and made a prompt decision to cut off everything, they were obviously not so lucky. In the end, they were really calculated to the extreme by the ice creature, and in the end, they even reached the point where they would inevitably die with the strength they had displayed at the beginning. The reason why they were still able to survive at this moment was because their innate nature far surpassed the strength that they had displayed back then. The attack that could absolutely crush the strength that they had displayed back then and kill them was clearly only able to kill them in the eyes of this world, but they were still alive. Of course, even if they still existed, they were still dead in the eyes of this world. As a result, the punishment they had suffered while staying in this world for so many years had caused them to suffer at every single moment. However, due to the anger in their hearts, they were unwilling to leave. They had stayed in this world and waited for an opportunity to take revenge. From their words, as well as the number of branches in the depths of the tundra, it was clear that these cultivators were clearly not all of the creatures that the ice creature had schemed against. They were clearly only a small portion of them. Most of the beings that had been schemed against could no longer endure the torture of the world's punishment and left this world through various methods. Let's go. I believe that everyone has already thought of how to take revenge, the cultivator said. As he spoke, he paid no attention to the others. The first thing he thought of was the ice field that was like a violent sea, and he charged straight towards it. In the blink of an eye, he had already charged into the icy plain. These cultivators had been punished by the world and had been suffering every moment of their lives. They could not even use the means to transcend the limits of the world and obtain extraordinary powers that they had been seeking in this world. However, these cultivators were able to stand out from the rest of the world and finally step into this world. As such, even though they were suffering and being punished, they had found their extraordinary abilities through other methods after so many years. If a normal cultivator had seen this method, they would have been incredibly shocked and would have prostrated themselves before these cultivators. However, to these cultivators, this kind of ability was almost a matter of course. They were not proud of themselves for finding some extraordinary abilities, nor were they surprised that other cultivators could find their extraordinary abilities. After all, these cultivators had a very clear understanding of themselves and their own kind. The cultivator dived into the icy plain and naturally released his extraordinary ability. He constructed a domain that was isolated from the influence of the surrounding ice. His body seemed to be swimming in water as he headed towards the depths of the icy plain. Behind him, the other cultivators also made their moves one after another. One by one, they unleashed their own methods and charged straight into the icy plain. They headed towards the deepest part of the icy plain. The deeper they went, the more intense and terrifying the turbulence became. Of course, the more difficult it was to resist. However, with the support of hatred and anger in their hearts, these cultivators did not slow down at all, even though their bodies were under great pressure. They did not hesitate at all and only continued to increase their speed as they dove downwards. They were heading towards the source of the cold laws in the deepest part of the world. Very soon, they saw the branch meridians that had integrated with their own laws. These branch meridians were already in a mess, and the connection between them and the countless worlds that had been derived from them was already faintly discernible. Following this inexplicable sense, they saw that at the end of their senses, the worlds that had integrated with their own laws were already in an incomparably huge vortex. This vortex was extremely strange. It seemed to be made of ice, but it was vaguely different from the surrounding ice. It seemed to be purer than the ice around it. That kind of whirlpool cut off all connections between the inside of the whirlpool and the outside ice field. It was this isolation that caused the connection between the world corresponding to the laws of the vortex and the branch meridians to become faintly discernible. To them, this connection seemed to be able to completely sever them if they exerted a little more strength. It's too late now. Seeing this scene, the cultivators sighed inwardly. If this had not happened when they were plotted against back then, they would not have been punished by the world for such a long time and suffered for such a long time. But now, they had found another path and another way to retrieve their extraordinary abilities. Under such circumstances, even if they cut off the connection between these branch meridians and the world and extracted the laws that they had integrated with the branch meridians again, it would be of no help. It was simply impossible to completely cut off the punishment from the world and eliminate the torture that they had suffered in this world. Therefore, at this moment, none of these cultivators stopped to control these branch meridians. Instead, they ignored the branch meridians and rushed straight down towards the source of the entire ice field. Each of these 17 cultivators was in existence with extremely firm minds. The fact that they could endure the constant torture for tens of millions of years, or even trillions of years, was proof of this. At this moment, even though they were constantly suffering incredible pressure in the process of advancing, they didn't stop at all, and all of them rushed downwards quickly. Very soon, they had already rushed into the source of the cold laws and arrived at where Luo Fan and the ice creature were. When they arrived at this place, they were all stunned. This was because they saw a scene that they could never have imagined. A cultivator and his clone were hovering above a sphere of ice. He raised his hand and covered the sphere with it. Heat constantly surged out from his hand and turned into sharp blades that pierced into the sphere, destroying it. At this moment, there were no longer any ice creatures around the sphere. Instead, there were only traces of chilliness, as well as the source of the cold laws that were like smoke. Faced with this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. The moment these creatures appeared, he instantly discovered their existence. How sharp was Luo Fan's perception? In an instant, he discovered the nature of these creatures. He could not help but smile faintly and said, "I didn't expect all of you to be guarding nearby. I have been here for so many years, and yet I didn't notice all of you. I really shouldn't have." As he spoke, a faint coldness appeared in his eyes. At this moment, the cultivators all looked at Luo Fan in disbelief. They looked like they were looking at an ant that had flipped over an elephant. They were filled with disbelief and absurdity. Luo Fan looked at these cultivators, and his expression gradually turned cold. He said, "This place has already been occupied by me. If you don't want to be my enemy, it's best that you leave immediately. Otherwise, after I deal with this person, it will be your turn." His words were merciless and did not leave the slightest bit of face for these cultivators. Hearing this, the cultivators were shocked. Then they all looked ashamed and anxious. They were also extremely intelligent cultivators, so they naturally knew why Luo Fan behaved like this. They had been guarding the ice field for at least tens of millions of years. In other words, when Luo Fan first entered the ice field, they obviously saw it with their own eyes. However, even under such circumstances, they had no intention of warning Luo Fan at all. From their standpoint, this did not seem to be too harsh. After all, they were not related to Luo Fan at all, so they naturally had no obligation to warn Luo Fan. However, from Luo Fan's standpoint, their actions were just watching him fall into a trap without doing anything. How could he be happy under such circumstances? Since they could do such a thing, there was naturally no need for Luo Fan to show any kindness to them. You can do what you want. Based on your standpoint, I naturally can't be harsh. However, I can also do what I want. You naturally can't say anything about what I do. It is our mistake for not warning you. However, you should also understand how we knew that you would be able to defeat this person. If you were in our shoes, I'm afraid you would have done the same," the cultivator with 18 arms and 8 eyes said. Hearing this, Luo Fan only nodded indifferently and said, "Of course, I admit that I would have done the same if I were in your shoes. However, I'm not in that position right now. Right now, I am in a position where you have all used me as bait. Since that is the case, you naturally can't blame me for doing what I have done." The cultivator was speechless. Indeed, they had their standpoint, and their actions were extremely normal from their standpoint. However, Luo Fuan clearly also had his own standpoint. After being treated like that, it was extremely normal for him to behave like this. At this moment, another cultivator interrupted and said, "There is no need to worry about who is right and who is wrong. The most important thing right now is to deal with that person." Chapter 26:11. Another cultivator said, "The most important thing for us to do now is to work together to restrain him, then think of a way to deal with that person through this avatar. Otherwise, everything fellow Taoist has done will be for naught." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "I've been waiting for him to come. Now that everyone is here, but he hasn't come yet. Isn't that enough to explain the problem?" The cultivators were slightly shocked. They originally thought that the cultivator would quickly rush over due to the loss of the clone and directly deal with all the cultivators who dealt with the clone. However, they didn't expect that if that was really the case, given the strength of that existence, how could he really not rush over after such a long time? After all, even if they were to stand guard near the ice field, they would only be standing guard outside the ice field. In this way, no matter how fast they were, it was impossible for them to compare to the speed of that cultivator who rushed over through the connection between his main body and the clone due to the layer of separation. In this case, the period of time they hesitated outside was actually enough for that existence to easily traverse the endless space-time from an extremely distant place, directly arrive at the location of the clone, and use his own methods to easily deal with the various changes that were happening in the ice field at this moment. When these cultivators thought of this, their hearts trembled. An indescribable despair emerged from the bottom of their hearts, causing their bodies to change inexplicably. Clearly, when they thought of this, they suddenly understood that it was actually meaningless for them to keep guarding here. Even if they could find an opportunity to deal with that person's clone, if that person really joined in with their main body, then everything that awaited them would probably turn into bubbles, and all their efforts would be for naught. Of course, this thought only appeared in their minds for a moment. Very soon, they shifted their attention from their thoughts to the scene in the depths of the ice field, where the source of the law of coldness was located. Given the connection between the main body and the clone, under normal circumstances, that person's main body should have arrived here long ago, and his clone should not have fallen into such a terrible situation. However, at this moment, that person's main body did not appear at all, and the clone situation only continued to worsen. The world that was connected to the clone also continued to collapse and be destroyed in the process. This situation was enough to show that things were not as he had imagined. Perhaps this incarnation was nothing to that person, or perhaps at this time, something had happened to that person's real body. Perhaps it had been imprisoned, or perhaps it had been sealed in some place. After thinking about it, they still felt that the second possibility was more likely. After all, they had all suffered greatly at the hands of that person's incarnation years ago. Even if they had regained their extraordinary powers through certain means, the torment and punishment left behind by their failure back then still existed at all times. Under such circumstances, for them to believe that such an incarnation was nothing to that person, and that he didn't even care about the loss of this incarnation, was simply asking them to admit that they were trash that couldn't even withstand something that the other party didn't care about. How was that possible? Since he wasn't willing to admit that he was trash, then they could only assume that he was busy with his own affairs. His real body didn't have the chance to come and help his incarnation. Thinking up to this point, the cultivators' eyes lit up. They looked at the distorted world, and their eyes were filled with indescribable hatred and joy. At this moment, Luo Fan said to the cultivators, "If you don't want any misunderstandings, please leave now." He looked at the cultivators indifferently, without much warmth in his eyes. The expressions on the faces of the cultivators changed. "Fellow cultivator, why are you doing this? I admit that what we did before was a bit inappropriate, but there's nothing we can do about it. Now that it's over, why don't we sit down and have a good talk?" One of the cultivators said helplessly, Luo Fan just faintly said, I understand you, and I also ask you to understand me. Please. When the cultivators saw how stubborn Luo Fan was, their hearts swelled with anger. They would rather take revenge for being schemed against by that ice creature. At the very least, they had guarded this ice field for tens of millions of years. Their mentality was self-evident. Now that the ice creature was right in front of him, waiting for him to torture it, it was easy to imagine how he was feeling right now. With this kind of feeling, how could they be driven away by Luo Fan's words? At this moment, all of them stopped there and looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable gaze. Luo Fan looked at them with a faint sneer on his face and said, Could it be that you want to fight me? Fellow cultivator doesn't know how much we paid to wait for this day. If you knew, you would know how determined we are. One of the cultivators said indifferently. The other cultivators looked extremely determined. Their eyes did not waver as they looked at Luo Fan, who was floating in the sky. At this time, Luo Fan's face showed a faint expression as he said, Paying a high price doesn't mean that the final victory will be yours. Now you're one step too slow. As he said that, a powerful aura was released from his body. A terrifying aura instantly soared into the sky and pressed down on the 17 cultivators. His current aura had already broken through the shackles of the pseudo-sage realm and stepped into the pseudo-sage realm. This aura could actually be considered a type of extraordinary ability. Originally, when he could only unleash the strength of the pseudo-sage realm, the aura that Luo Fan could unleash was naturally only at the peak of the pseudo-sage realm. In this way, it was very obvious what it meant to be able to unleash the aura of the pseudo-sage realm. Through the battle with the ice creature, just now, Luo Fan had comprehended some key points and brazenly allowed the strength that he could unleash in this world to step into the pseudo-sage realm. This could not be said to be a blessing in disguise, but it could be considered an unexpected gain. After all, he had originally thought of obtaining such a breakthrough within 1,000,000 years. But now he had completed such a breakthrough in such a short period of time. No matter how one looked at it, it was a pleasant surprise. As the aura pressed down, the cultivators felt as if even breathing had become difficult. How was this possible? They were all extremely shocked and felt that their worldview was about to be overturned. They had personally witnessed Luo Fan stepping into the ice field from the outside with their own eyes. They knew very well what level Luo Fan was at back then. And now, in such a short period of less than 10,000 years, he had actually grown to such an unbelievable level. Just his aura alone was enough to completely suppress them, making them feel as if they were about to lose their lives in the next moment. The extent of this increase had completely subverted their worldview. Although these cultivators had extremely firm wills, they had been killed by the ice creature when they were still at their peak. It went without saying how much strength they could unleash in this world. And now, they had only managed to grab back a little bit of their transcendent power from the punishment and torture of this world. Compared to when they were at their peak, the difference was simply incomparably huge. Under such circumstances, facing Luo Fan, who had already raised the strength that he could unleash to the pseudo-sage realm, how could they have the ability to resist? Just this aura alone was enough to shock these cultivators to the point that they even lost the ability to move. Everyone, please. Luo Fan was already completely relieved. As he spoke, he casually waved his hand, and these cultivators were already wrapped by an invisible force. They rushed up and disappeared into the source of the cold laws in the blink of an eye. Then they pushed aside everything and rushed out of this ice field. They directly appeared in the air above the ice field and floated there quietly. At this moment, those cultivators had yet to fully react, and their expressions were still extremely blank. It took them a while to understand what they had encountered just now. What should we do now? Should we go challenge it again? A cultivator asked. Hearing this, the expressions of the other cultivators changed slightly. Challenge him again? What was the difference between the outcome and now? They were weaker than him just now, but could their current strength be comparable to his now? That's why he showed mercy just now. If we continue, it might not be the same. Another cultivator sighed and shook his head. With the strength that Luo Fan had displayed just now, it was not difficult at all for him to get rid of all of them easily and let them die again in the eyes of this world. Putting everything else aside, as long as the aura changed slightly, they would probably be in a state where they would beg for death. However, under such circumstances, the other party did not do so. He merely waved his hand and borrowed a force to easily send them out of the depths of the ice field and out of the ice field. They were not unable to differentiate good from bad. Naturally, they could see that Luo Fan had already been merciful before. However, just because Yi Futian showed mercy earlier did not mean that he would show mercy again. After all, even a rabbit would bite when it was cornered. Yi Futian still had the patience to suppress his urge to completely wipe them out. However, if they did not know what was good for them and continued to pester him, then Yi Futian would obviously not be so patient. Yi Futian had already predicted that Yi Futian would deal with them. When the other cultivators heard this, they all sighed inwardly. Indeed, if they continued to pester him, Yi Futian would not even need to attack. He only needed to slap them, and they would die again in the eyes of the world. So, are we just going to wait like this? Another cultivator sighed. There was a strong sense of unwillingness in his voice. After all, even the shortest period of time had been here for tens of millions of years. They had been waiting for something like this to happen. They were waiting for the icy creature to suffer a great loss. Now, the icy creature was clearly a fish on the chopping board, yet they could only wait outside. They did not even have the chance to see what would happen to it. How could they feel at ease? That's the only way. One of the cultivators sighed, and a strange smile appeared on his face. We didn't wait here for so many years just to see that person die with our own eyes. We only want that person to go through what we've gone through all these years. It's good to see it with our own eyes, but it's just a pity that we can't see it with our own eyes. If we disturb that fellow cultivator and cause him to make a mistake, I'm afraid I won't have the confidence to wait for trillions of years, he added. Hearing this, the other cultivators came to a realization. The anxiety in their hearts gradually calmed down. Indeed, they were only waiting for that person to suffer a loss, but not to see that person suffer a loss with their own eyes. Although it was a pity that they could not see it with their own eyes, this kind of regret was insignificant compared to letting that person go. Thinking of this, they all calmed down. That's right. Let's wait, another cultivator said. The other cultivators also chimed in one after another. In just a few short sentences, the scene had already calmed down. Luo Fan did not care about the choices of those cultivators. After all, the strongest of those cultivators was only about the same as a Khanate Grand Luo. This kind of strength was naturally extremely shocking and terrifying to the ordinary living beings in this world. However, compared to Luo Fan, who could already unleash the strength of a false sage, it was completely insufficient. Even if those cultivators came again, he would at most give them another slap. However, it would not hinder him at all. He could still deal with that icy creature the same way he dealt with it. Since that was the case, he naturally did not have a mood to care about those living beings. At this moment, he only focused his attention on the world in front of him. He continuously condensed heat blades and inserted them into the world, turning into heat fiend gods that continuously resisted the resistance of the world, causing more and more damage to the world. Chapter 26:12. However, even so, the ice creature was still having a hard time resisting. Although this world was extremely perfect, and the laws and even the great Tao had reached a rather perfect level, the power of this world alone was enough to shock any cultivator. However, it was useless. The world was still the world. Compared to cultivators, it was still lacking in terms of flexibility. In particular, compared to an existence like Luo Fan, it was like sending his weakness straight to his doorstep. Under such circumstances, although the strength that Luo Fan could display was only at the false saint realm, it was enough to easily suppress this world with this method that he could casually use. Even if this world had its owner, the avatar of the ice creature helping to control it, it could only retreat step by step and fall into the abyss that had completely collapsed. It was as if a huge but extremely slow existence was facing an existence that was almost the same level as it, but was thousands of times more agile than it. If the existence it faced was weak and could not threaten its essence, then it would naturally not care, and no matter how it attacked, it would not be affected. However, if the existence it faced was strong enough to threaten its essence, then its fate would be determined. At this moment, this was the situation of this world. Under the havoc caused by the heat blades released by Luo Fan, countless targeted changes were born in that part of the world, and even the level of the creatures in it was constantly increasing. However, in the end, they could only watch as more and more areas of the world were destroyed, and the whole world was destroyed more and more thoroughly. Although the ice creature was already in this world, it did not condense its body like it did in the outside world. Instead, it was like the heavenly Tao, fusing with the world. It used its own will to control everything in this world, guiding this world to resist the countless heat demons that Luo Fan had sent into this world. The flow of time in this world was completely independent of the outside world. Although it had only been a few days since the collapse, tens of millions of years had passed in this world. These tens of millions of years were naturally nothing to the ice creature or even to Luo Fan. It was not even enough for them to pay too much attention to it. However, to this world, such a long period of time was enough for all the living beings and cultivators in this world to undergo drastic changes, causing the entire world to change. After tens of millions of years, in the hearts of the newly born beings and the newly matured cultivators, this world had been in such a chaotic state since the very beginning. In this state, they were naturally extremely adapted to the chaos in this world, and their combat abilities were many times stronger than the creatures and cultivators in this world in the past. In fact, due to the pressure of the end of the world, their potential was stimulated. Compared to before the world changed, their average strength was at least a level higher. However, even so, close to 60% of this world had already collapsed. Only 40% of the world remained intact and could still bear the countless creatures. If this continued, it would only be a matter of tens of millions of years before this world completely collapsed. Faced with such a situation, the ice creature made a move. Under its will, the flow of time in this world gradually began to change. Originally, a few days in the outside world was equivalent to tens of millions of years in this world, and it gradually slowed down. In just a few breaths of time, it had slowed down to the same speed as the outside world. Seeing this, Luo Fan slightly frowned, although this world could not resist him at all. However, in the end, this world was too big, and the power it contained was too much. In addition, there was the ice creature controlling all of this power and power. With all of this combined, it would take quite some time for Luo Fan to completely destroy this world. So that was the case. The flow of time in this world was countless times faster than the outside world. This was exactly what he wanted. Not only did it save him time, but it also reduced the possibility of other problems arising. However, now that the ice creature had made such an adjustment, the situation was completely different. After this adjustment, the flow of time in this world was no different from the outside world. This world that could originally be dealt with in a few days immediately became a task that would take tens of millions of years to complete. This was a good thing for the ice creature, but for Luo Fan, it was a terrible thing. After all, the ice creature was only a clone no matter what. He did not know when its more powerful main body would descend. Under such circumstances, was he going to delay here for tens of millions of years? This was simply equivalent to waiting for the ice creature's main body to come and deal with him for tens of millions of years. Naturally, Luo Fan would not be willing to do this. At this moment, he looked at the world. Although he did not stop moving, his thoughts were constantly flashing. He was trying his best to find other ways to deal with this world and the ice creature in it. He didn't do this before, but he's doing it now. Does this mean that the situation on his main body's side has changed? Is his main body confident of rushing over in tens of millions of years? This thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind, causing his expression to become more and more solemn. The ice creature was not a fool. If Luo Fan could think of something, it should be able to think of it as well. At the very least, it should be able to think of a large part of the basic conditions. However, even though it could think of this, it did not display this change at the beginning. Instead, it waited until most of the world was dealt with before displaying this change. This made one wonder if something had happened during this period of time, making this change from something that was originally meaningless to something meaningful. I must not go along with his wishes. Luo Fan had already made up his mind as his thoughts flashed. No matter what the other party's intentions were, no matter what changes had happened to the other party's main body, Luo Fan had already made up his mind. He definitely could not go along with the other party's rhythm. He had to use the fastest time to deal with the world in front of him and deal with the ice creature's clone. With that in mind, he no longer hesitated. His heat clone shuddered and completely collapsed, transforming into boundless heat energy. Like a giant dragon, it pounced toward that area of heaven and earth. This heat clone was condensed from the heat that existed when the old and new worlds collapsed and was contaminated with his laws. Not to mention anything else, just the quantity alone had already reached an unbelievable level. Coupled with the world view that had been fused with it, the power of this heat clone's ability could be imagined. Now that the endless heat that formed this heat clone had completely collapsed and turned into a huge dragon, the scale of which was unimaginable. In front of this giant dragon, even that part of the world actually seemed somewhat small. It seemed like it couldn't even fill one of the dragon's claws. At this moment, the dragon's claws had already grabbed that world. Along with that claw, the dragon's claw had already seeped into the heavens and earth without any changes. It was as if there was an indescribable suction force that had started to absorb the heat. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan did not panic at all. Instead, he was extremely calm. It was as if everything was going according to his expectations. As the claws entered that world, the dragon's body also began to penetrate that world. Not long after, the entire dragon had completely integrated into the world. It was like a layer of clouds that covered the sky and covered the sun, covering the entire sky. At this moment, the heat gods that had already entered that world and started to wreak havoc for a long time seemed to have obtained endless nutrients. They started to swell continuously, their movements becoming more ferocious, and their destructive power became even stronger. As a result, the pressure on the entire world became even greater. Faced with this change, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. His perception seemed to have completely fused with the heat. As if he was controlling his own body, he manipulated the endless heat that had seeped into that world. The endless heat seemed to have developed intelligence, and all the changes of the heat became more and more exquisite. The use of heat also became more and more mysterious. Under this change, the benefits that the countless heat gods received were even greater. Their strength had almost increased by 100 times. Originally, after tens of millions of years of development, although the living beings in this world still could not compare to the heat gods, they had already figured out some effective methods to deal with the heat gods. But now, with Luo Fan's will, everything changed. In the past, the methods that their ancestors had researched to deal with the heat gods collapsed without much effort. With this collapse, even if the strength of the gods was still the same as before, it was enough for them to gain the absolute upper hand in this war. Moreover, compared to before, the strength of these god fiends had increased by 1,000 times. Under such circumstances, the situation that had gradually stabilized began to rapidly deteriorate. In just a few short days, more than 10% of this world had been destroyed. At this point, as if a certain boundary had been broken, the atmosphere of the entire world had changed. The originally clear sky had unknowingly turned a dark blood-like red. There was also a foul stench that appeared out of nowhere. It filled the entire world, causing all living beings and existences in this world to be able to smell this foul stench. The heavenly Tao that was originally hidden in the depths of the world, or rather, the heavenly Tao behind the world, also revealed its true form. Although it had the home advantage in this world, it was still only an advantage. However, an advantage was only an advantage after all. It wasn't a victory. In such a situation, facing such a drastic change, whether it was the world or the ice creature, they could no longer remain calm. At this moment, the ice creature had turned into the heavenly Tao and appeared in the sky. Lightning flashed around it, and boundless light shone from its body, illuminating the entire world. It did its best to disperse the dark, blood-like luster that filled this world. Of course, this wasn't without a price. After doing all this, the aura on the ice creature's body had already weakened a little. As the aura faded, a blood-like dark red aura reappeared after disappearing. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the dark red color was constantly being born here. Even if it was erased, it could recover very quickly. Just erasing it once was clearly not enough to completely erase the dark red luster. For the living beings that had survived in this world, the current scene was truly a scene of the end of the world. And the appearance of the heavenly Tao was the appearance of the will of the world to them. Seeing the heavenly Tao display its might and expel the dark blood-like red that filled the entire world, countless living beings began to cheer. They began to cheer because they saw the dawn of victory. However, their cheers soon came to an abrupt end. That was because they suddenly realized that this dark red color was endless, even though it had already been completely expelled just now, causing the entire world to no longer be able to see a trace of that dark red luster. In the next instant, it actually reappeared and began to contaminate the entire world again, causing the world to once again sink into the abyss of depravity. Under such circumstances, how could they cheer as they did before? How could they still have such strong hopes? At this moment, the heavenly Tao moved again. Without any visible movement, all the laws in this world began to rapidly gather towards the heavenly Tao like rivers flowing into the sea. Liala Liala. Chapter 26:14. The heavenly Tao began to squirm continuously. Faintly, a giant's body began to condense above the heavenly Tao that filled the world. This figure was so huge, so condensed, and so powerful. Just by appearing, it had already caused the entire world to violently tremble. As this tremor spread, countless cracks began to appear in this part of the world. These cracks went deep into the world, and it felt like the world was starting to shatter from the inside out. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan had a strange expression on his face. It seemed like the ice creature wanted to fuse all the essence of the world into its body and completely break free from the shackles the world had placed on it. However, after thinking about it, he came to a realization. Indeed, this seemed to be the ice creature's best choice. After all, at this moment, he was being steadily defeated. If he continued to be tied to this world like before, he would no longer be able to obtain the benefits that he had in the past. Instead, he would sink into the abyss of death because of this world's burdens. In this situation, it was clearly better to plunder the world and take away all the essence in this world. Only then would it be able to reduce its losses as much as possible. Luo Fan only sneered at this thought. The essence of the world was perfectly fused with the world. Trying to extract it from all over the world was an inconceivably difficult task. Even if the ice creature could be considered the creator of this world, it would not be able to do it so smoothly. At the very least, it would not be able to extract all the essence during the process. Even if it disregarded the bearing capacity of the world and forcefully extracted it, it would only obtain a small portion of the essence in the end. As for the rest, most of the essence would be consumed during this process. Under such circumstances, what level could the ice creature reach after obtaining all the essence? Perhaps it would only be able to completely recover from the injuries it had suffered. Even if there was an increase on this foundation, it would only be an insignificant increase. In this case, if Luo Fan was still the same as before, it would naturally be somewhat dangerous, and he would have to carefully consider the outcome. However, it was clear that the current Luo Fan was no longer the same as before. Through the previous battle and confrontation, he had already comprehended the trick to unleashing power that surpassed the false saint stage in this world. This comprehension allowed the level of strength that he could unleash in this world had already reached the false saint stage. In this way, there was no longer any fundamental difference between him and the ice creature. There was no intrinsic difference, and he had the upper hand in the situation. In this way, how could Luo Fan fail? Of course, even if the other party plundered all the essence, Luo Fan was confident that he could defeat it. However, this did not mean that Luo Fan would just watch it plunder the essence and completely absorb everything of value in this world. Although that would not have a decisive impact on the outcome, it would still cause him more trouble. Therefore, at this moment, after seeing through the ice creature's intentions, Luo Fan did not hesitate to change the behavior of the many heat gods and demons that had been sent into the world and the heat clouds that covered the entire world. Whether it was the heat clouds or the heat gods and demons, they all began to help the world strengthen itself, strengthening the protection of the world for its evolution, and creating obstacles for the ice creature to absorb the essence. This method made the giant condensed from the heavenly Tao, which was the ice creature's incarnation, furious. Fellow Taoist, why are you doing this? I've already admitted defeat, so why are you still being so overbearing? After struggling for a long time, he realized that the speed at which he extracted the essence had been greatly slowed down. Even the world had begun to instinctively resist him, so he had no choice but to cry out. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "Do you think we're playing house? Admit defeat? Who said that their battle would end as long as one side admitted defeat? The current situation was that they would not rest until one side died." Seeing this, the ice creature did not say anything else. What he said before was obviously just to try his luck, and he did not really put all his hopes on it. At this time, when he heard Luo Fan say this, he knew that the best possibility that he hoped for was already impossible to appear. Immediately, a surging chill was released from his body and rushed towards the entire world. In the blink of an eye, it had already seeped into the depths of all the laws in the world, and even into the great ways. As the chill seeped in, the entire world seemed to have instantly turned into a world of ice. Everything seemed to be frozen. Even time seemed to have been affected at this moment, causing the flow of time in this world to become extremely slow. Vaguely, it seemed like millions of years had passed in this world, but only a day and a half had passed in the outside world. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan deeply furrowed his brows. His body was outside this world, but he could clearly sense the changes in this world. At this moment, when he looked over, it seemed as if time had stopped in this part of the world. All changes had stopped. Whether it was the changes in the natural landscape, his heat demons, the changes in the heat clouds, or all the actions of the ice creature, everything seemed to have completely stopped. At a glance, the entire world seemed to have turned into a static, three-dimensional model, without any of the charm of a normal world. In the end, it still wants to stall for time. At this moment, Luo Fan already understood. He now truly understood that the ice creature was not really admitting defeat. Instead, it was just stalling for time in another way. The essence of the world that it had absorbed was actually not to strengthen itself, but to slow down the flow of time in this world. To an existence at Luo Fan's level, changing the flow of time within a certain range was only a matter of thought. In this world, due to the shackles of the world, the power and strength that existences at their level could display were greatly weakened. Changing the flow of time was no longer as convenient as before. It could be said that if this world had not been created by the ice creature, it would have been impossible for him to change the flow of time so casually within it. Even so, this kind of change still had quite a lot of limitations. The limitation was that this change could not last for long without the support of external forces. Before this world could constantly absorb the power of the laws from the source of the cold laws outside, so it could maintain the rapid flow of time for a long time. As a result, it obtained countless times more time than the outside world to cultivate and do other things. However, after the destruction caused by the heat that Luo Fan had sent in, This mechanism of constantly absorbing the power of laws from the outside world could no longer be maintained. As a result, even with the ice creature's ability, it could not change the flow of time in this world for too long. This was also the fundamental reason why the ice creature did not directly slow down the flow of time in this world to an unbelievable level. Instead, it directly made it equal to the flow of time in the outside world. However, judging from the previous situation, even if the flow of time in this world was equal to the flow of time in the outside world, this world did not seem to be able to delay the destruction of this world for too long. If it did not continue to slow down, this world would probably completely collapse in a few months. This was why the ice creature had turned around and absorbed the essence of this world, using this essence to maintain the slowing down of time. However, to that world, such a method would, of course, result in an incomparably shocking loss. Even if this world survived this disaster, its vitality would definitely be greatly damaged, and it was uncertain whether it could recover to its original peak state. However, this was ultimately a path of delaying time. If everything went smoothly, there should be no problem waiting for its main body to arrive and easily get rid of Luofan. This was the exact reason why the ice creature would make such a choice at this time. In the face of such a situation, Luofan no longer hesitated. His heart slightly moved, and he raised his hand to grab the void. Infinite heat gushed out of his body and turned into countless sharp blades in the void. They suddenly condensed into the shape of a palm and fiercely grabbed towards the heaven and earth. The palm of sharp blades condensed in the void. It contained endless power, and the surrounding source of the laws of cold could not withstand it. At this moment, all sorts of indescribable chaos occurred. Countless mysterious cracks appeared on the source of the laws of cold, and indescribable heat could be vaguely felt from them. Chi, 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 chi. The palm formed by the heat blades stabbed straight into the world. These sounds were produced by the countless sharp blades on the palm, cutting the sky and earth. Amidst these sounds, countless holes appeared on the surface of the world. However, that was all there was to it. In the next moment, Luofan's expression slightly froze, but he suddenly found that the palm formed by the heat blade that he had condensed seemed to be blocked by some completely unstoppable force. No matter how much strength he used, no matter how much strength he exerted, he couldn't make the sharp blade go any further. Or rather, it could not be said that it could not advance a single step, but the speed at which it was advancing was already so slow that he could not feel it at all. The flow of time. At this moment, Luofan understood why the ice creature did not care about his attacks on the world outside. The change in the flow of time in this world actually penetrated the outer layer of the world, penetrating the outer layer. Under such circumstances, any attack that didn't come into contact with this world would be fine. But as long as it came into contact with this world, it would naturally be affected by the flow of time, and it would become extremely slow from its original extreme speed. This kind of slowness was almost absolute, no matter how Luofan activated it. Even if it surpassed time, as long as it truly reached that world, it would naturally become compatible with the flow of time in that world. From the outside, it would seem extremely slow. Under such circumstances, Luofan's attacks would naturally encounter incredible resistance when they entered that world, and they would not be able to advance at all. With a thought, Luofan dispersed his heat blades. As he dispersed them, he discovered that his heat blades had directly broken off the surface of the world. That sharp blade that had penetrated into the heavens and earth still existed, but its connection with the blade outside had been completely severed. It looked like an invisible blade had sliced through the surface of the heavens and earth, cutting off everything that had entered the heavens and earth, leaving in the heavens and earth. Faced with such a situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luofan's face as he smiled bitterly. He actually used this kind of method to defend. In this case, there really isn't any way to deal with it in a short time. He sighed inwardly. Although he sighed inwardly, he clearly could not give up just like that. The attack that he had executed just now was only the most basic and simplest kind of attack. This kind of attack was blocked. Perhaps it was because this kind of attack was too simple, too direct. Immediately, he began to change the nature of the heat. Through the transformation and combination of the heat, he turned it into all sorts of strange attacks that constantly pounced on that world. It could be sound waves, light, pure heat, lightning, all sorts of strange treasures, or all sorts of divine abilities. In the end, he even forcibly simulated the divine ability with the help of the heat. Countless attacks bombarded the heavens and earth continuously, constantly affecting the heavens and earth. However, in the end, all these attacks only caused the surface of the world to become riddled with holes. The world itself, or at least the body of the world, did not suffer any damage. The world was still the world, and the main body was still unaffected. Chapter 26:15. F***CK. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan suddenly felt a headache. At this moment, the only thing he could do was to slow down the flow of time in that world. As for everything else, even if he slowed down the flow of time outside the world and rebalanced the flow of time inside and outside the world so that his attacks would no longer be obstructed and he could easily penetrate that world, it would still be impossible for him to achieve his goal. After all, to the ice creature, the most important thing now was to stall for time. As long as he could stall for time, he didn't care even if this world collapsed. Under such circumstances, if he slowed down the flow of time in the outside world, even if the effects of each of his moves were extremely obvious and could cause unimaginable damage to the world by the time he destroyed the world, who knew how many tens of thousands of years would have passed? By then, he would have achieved the ice creature's goal of stalling for time. Moreover, even changing the flow of time at the source of the cold law outside the world was an impossible task for Luo Fan. At least, it was an impossible task for him now. After all, he could only use heat to unleash various extraordinary abilities in this world. Even though the nature of the heat had far surpassed ordinary heat after integrating with his worldview of laws, and he could unleash many extraordinary characteristics that ordinary heat could not, it was still heat in the end. Resisting the shackles of this world and controlling the flow of time in this world, the heat was ultimately not enough. Therefore, even if this method was feasible, Luo Fan could not use it at this moment. All sorts of thoughts appeared in his mind, but they quickly disappeared without a trace, causing him to sink into a headache. But in that case, if I want to escape, he won't be able to stop me, right? This thought surfaced in Luo Fan's mind at a certain moment. He could not help but smile bitterly as he thought of this. From a certain point of view, the ice creature had indeed admitted defeat. After all, given how domineering it was, it should have completely sealed off the source of the cold law and completely cut off his escape route before fighting him. However, it was only protecting itself and allowing Luo Fan to stay or leave as he pleased. It was clearly trying to protect itself, and it no longer had much hope of keeping Luo Fan here. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan gave up on dealing with the ice creature and turned to leave, the ice creature would obviously not be able to do anything. However, it was a pity that Luo Fan was unwilling to leave just like that. Not only was it because the ice creature had schemed against him, but it was also because if he escaped, he would not only lose the wonderful cultivation environment of the origin of the laws of cold, but he would also have to hide in order to avoid being found by the ice creature's main body. That kind of grievance was not something he was willing to endure. Stalling for time? Since that's the case, let's see who's faster. A fighting spirit emerged in Luo Fan. As he thought about it, he decided to change his approach. He no longer tried to increase his speed to escape the ice creature's main body. Instead, he took the initiative to fight and prepare to welcome the arrival of the ice creature's main body. As long as he did not want to endure the humiliation of hiding everywhere, then the ice creature's main body would be an enemy that he had to face. No matter what he did now, no matter how he dealt with the ice creature's main body, even if he had to deal with it in an instant, if he did not have the strength to face the ice creature's main body, then he could only choose to escape when the ice creature's main body arrived in the future. In the end, he would have to endure the humiliation of hiding everywhere. As long as he could fight the ice creature's main body to a standstill, the situation would be completely different. If that was the case, no matter how the situation developed, no matter how long the world the ice creature opened up could last in front of him, even if it could last until the ice creature's main body arrived, he would be able to erase it right in front of its main body. He could even easily erase its main body. Therefore, right now, the most important thing was his own cultivation. It was the strength that he could display in this world. Without him blocking me, I can do whatever I want here. I can cultivate however I want, and I don't have to worry about him anymore. With this thought in mind, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. However, he had already grasped the key to doing things, and he was no longer disturbed by the appearance of the battle from before. With this thought in mind, his heart trembled slightly. He raised his hand and grabbed at the air. Endless heat rushed out of his body and turned into countless strange lines that rushed toward the world. These lines were densely packed, and looking at their numbers, there were probably hundreds of millions of them. When those lines reached outside the world, they began to rapidly twist and interweave. In the blink of an eye, they had already turned into an incomparably tight formation, firmly enveloping the world. It formed an unimaginable sealing effect, isolating the world from the outside. Although he had to focus his next actions on cultivation, it did not mean that he had to completely let go of his vigilance against the ice creature. The ice creature had admitted defeat and allowed him to do whatever he wanted, but it did not mean that he would always think that way. Perhaps when he realized that the situation was not right, he would directly fall out with him and plot against him again like how he had schemed against him previously. If that was the case, if he allowed that world to be placed here, it would be equivalent to placing a bomb beside Luo Fan that could explode at any time and blast him into pieces. If he did not make certain preparations and set up certain defenses, how could he really fall into cultivation? And this formation was the defensive preparations he had made. This formation itself had an extremely shocking defensive power that could block the attacks of false saints. In this case, if the ice creature's incarnation attacked directly, it would definitely not be able to break this formation immediately. Of course, this did not mean that if the ice creature used the power of heaven and earth to unleash an attack that exceeded the false saint level, this formation would be helpless. In reality, the true mystery of the formation lay in dealing with attacks that exceeded the defensive capabilities of the formation. If there was an attack that exceeded the limits of this formation, then the moment the formation was broken, it would naturally release the effect of slowing down the flow of time, directly slowing down the speed of the attack by countless times. At the same time, Luo Fan would sense the collapse of this formation. At that time, no matter how engrossed he was in cultivation, he would definitely be able to react. Thus, the sneak attack effect will be directly abolished. At this moment, such preparations could already be said to be foolproof. Of course, the effect of slowing down the flow of time was barely achievable after all. The effect could not be too stable, and it could not be maintained for too long. However, it was clearly more than enough to allow Luo Fan to react. After doing all this, Luo Fan no longer paid attention to this world and began to turn his gaze to the source of the cold laws around him. At this moment, he realized that the source of the cold laws had undergone an earth-shattering change compared to the first time he saw it. The laws within were deeper and more complicated, and the impact on the source of the heat laws in his body had also become greater. The many details of the source of the heat laws that he had already divided to a place that was difficult to distinguish actually had a movement that was more than 10,000 times greater than before. This movement that was more than 10,000 times greater meant that the scale that he could comprehend had shrunk to more than 10,000 times greater than before. It's actually imprisoned. Damn it. At this moment, an indescribable anger suddenly surged in Luo Fan's heart. It turned out that the source of the cold laws that he had felt after entering this ice field had actually been imprisoned by the ice creature through some kind of method. This kind of imprisonment caused the mutual influence between the source of the cold laws and the source of the heat laws that he had always felt to be greatly weakened. To him, This was clearly cutting off his path of cultivation. No matter where it was, this could be considered an irreconcilable enmity. At this moment, Luo Fan's determination to fight the main body of the ice creature became even firmer. After such a thought emerged in his heart, he quickly suppressed it. The most important thing at this time was not to be resentful or vent his anger, but to cultivate. Since he had already made up his mind to fight against the ice creature's main body, even to the point of having a life and death battle, then he had to make use of every bit of cultivation time he had. He had to do his best to raise his strength to a level that surpassed the ice creature's main body before it arrived at some unknown time. In this way, he naturally did not have much time to immerse himself in that kind of anger. As he focused his attention on the source of the heat laws inside his body, he felt as if there was an explosion. Endless truths and mysteries were continuously released and understood by him. They either fused into his body, turned into resources for the growth of his worldview, or fused into the heat circulation system in his body. At this moment, the ice creature sensed the countless attacks that appeared on the surface of the world and instantly dissipated after entering the world. An indescribable expression appeared on its face. It seemed to be a little happy, but it also seemed to be extremely angry. In the end, it turned into a deep sense of helplessness. In this case, I should be able to stall until the main body arrives. This thought appeared in the bottom of its heart. The attacks that broke into this world from outside the world were naturally launched by Luo Fan. In Luo Fan's opinion, those attacks stopped after entering the world's surface, as if they would stop there for an eternity. However, in the eyes of the living beings in this world, and in the eyes of the ice creature, those attacks entered this world at a normal speed. If it wasn't for the fact that the source had long since been lost, every attack would have been enough to cause unimaginable damage to this world. The reason for this was naturally because of the flow of time. From the outside, the flow of time in this world had already slowed down to an indescribable level. It was as if everything in this world had stopped. Everything in this world seemed to have frozen, as if the entire world had turned into a model. However, in the eyes of the living beings in that world, the world outside had become extremely fast and nimble. On the contrary, everything in this world was developing at a normal speed. This was why the visual effect was different. In fact, by the time these living beings sensed the attacks that broke into this world dissipate, who knew how many tens of thousands of years had passed in the outside world? As for why the attacks had dissipated, it was naturally because the source of the attacks had already been cut off countless tens of thousands of years ago. Without the support of the source, the attacks were naturally empty. They could not even resist the natural resistance of this world, and they directly disappeared the moment they came into contact with the world. While Luo Fan made up his mind to cultivate, the cultivators who were prepared to cooperate with him on the ice field fell into a dilemma. Why is there no movement below? Is the battle over? One of the cultivators said, a conflicted look on his face. The ice field gradually calmed down, which clearly meant that the turbulence in the depths of the ice field had stopped. In this case, based on what they had seen before, it was obvious that the battle below had stopped. However, since the battle had stopped, why didn't the punishment of the heavens and earth decrease at all? Although this world had many punishments and restrictions for the deaths they saw, it was not impossible to get rid of these punishments and restrictions. If they used some methods to kill the existences that killed them instead, a portion of the punishments and restrictions would be shared by them. The punishments and restrictions they received would naturally be reduced as a result. Even if they did not directly kill the existences, the punishment and restrictions would be reduced, but no matter how reduced, they still existed. Chapter 26:16. These cultivators were at a loss, and none of them could guess what had happened below. An inexplicable sense of worry gradually appeared in their hearts. It was a sense of worry that the ice creature had turned the tables on them. They had been guarding this ice field for many years and had witnessed how powerful the ice creature was. This kind of power gave them a shocking amount of pressure. Even if they were unwilling, they had to admit that they were afraid of the ice creature. This fear made them pay close attention to the fate of the ice creature. especially when it seemed like they were only a step away from success. If it turns the tables on us, what should we do? What will it do to me? This thought kept appearing in their minds, causing their expressions to change subtly. Their auras all changed inexplicably. At this moment, facing this change, one cultivator could not help but say to the other cultivators. He said to the other cultivators, "I plan to go down and take a look. What does everyone think?" The other cultivators all fell silent. After a while, a few of them made up their minds to go down and take a look. The rest were still in the midst of hesitation. Needless to say, there was no need to mention their hatred for the ice creature. It was absolutely incomparably intense. But at the same time, the fear he felt for the ice creature was still there. Under these circumstances, they guessed that the ice creature might have turned the tables on them and killed the creature that had chased them out. They naturally became hesitant and did not know if they should go up and get into trouble. The ice creature that was preparing to go down and observe the situation didn't continue to wait. At this time, the 5 of them, a total of 5 cultivators, had formed a group and descended to the calm ice field below. At this moment, although the ice field was calm, it was no longer as flat as it used to be. At this moment, the ice field was undulating and filled with cracks. It looked even more complex, diverse, and rich than the terrain of this world. The closer they got to the ice field, the more nervous the cultivators felt. The closer they got to this frozen state, the more they could feel the power contained within and the terror of the power that had created this terrain. Under these circumstances, the closer they got to the terrain, the more they could clearly feel the terror of the existence below. Naturally, he felt a kind of nervousness that he didn't feel when he was watching from above. However, these cultivators were not ordinary cultivators. After all, they could still recover their extraordinary powers after being killed once, and they could still spy on the side to deal with the ice creatures. In the face of such terror, none of them flinched. They didn't even hesitate. One by one, they unleashed their extraordinary abilities and charged into the ice field, heading towards the depths of the ice field. After the 5 cultivators charged into the ice field, the cultivators on the surface of the ice field anxiously observed the changes happening to the ice field below. They were waiting for the movements that the 5 cultivators might cause. However, after waiting for a very long time, the area below remained the same as before, frozen in that ferocious and frightening state. No other activity was emitted from it. If it wasn't for the fact that they had clearly lost 5 of their companions, they might have suspected that the 5 cultivators hadn't entered the ice field at all. In the face of such a situation, some of the cultivators secretly regretted. "If I had known, I would have stopped them. It is indeed extremely dangerous down there. Looks like we can't stay here anymore." With that thought, a few of them turned around and left the ice field. This time, they didn't stay near the ice field. Instead, they headed into the distance. It was obvious that their mentality had changed after what had happened. Their hatred for the ice creature was no longer as intense. At the very least, they didn't think that staying here was a good choice. At this moment, there were only 7 living beings left in this place. These 7 cultivators were among the cultivators that had not changed their minds. They still held onto their hatred for the ice creature, but their fear of the ice creature was still strong enough that they did not dare to explore that part of it. They were unwilling to leave, and they didn't dare to go down. In that case, they could only wait here. Even if I die again, I want to see the final result. That was the cultivators' determination. At this moment, the cultivators didn't leave. They used their extraordinary abilities to gather power and materials to construct their respective cultivation abodes in the air. If they were in another world with the strength that they had obtained after so many competitions to enter this world, they could even split the sky and earth and use the world to form their own cave abodes and Taoist rites. It would only take a single thought for them to do so. Naturally, they could create their own cave abodes here. However, it was obvious that this was not another world. In this place, although they all had some extraordinary abilities, they were still far from their true strength. In the end, there was still a limit to what they could do. These various limitations made it so that each of them would have to use all their means and effort to create their own cave abodes. Moreover, even if they succeeded in the end, the result might not be perfect. The cave abodes they created might have many limitations, and they might even become extremely ugly. Therefore, at this time, they didn't create their own cave abodes separately. Instead, they helped each other and cooperated to open up cave abodes one after another. Although there were only 7 cultivators and only 7 extraordinary abilities, and each of them had many ways to control them, under the use of these cultivators, the effect of their combination was richer and more profound than the combination of thousands of extraordinary abilities. The cave abodes that they created were also extremely mysterious. Not only was it huge, but it was also extremely hidden. From afar, it seemed like there were some strange shadows in the air. It felt like there was some kind of natural scenery above this ice field. If the cave abodes that they had opened up together were taken out, there were probably only a few cave abodes that could compare to them in other worlds. Even for those false saints whose mystical abilities were unrestricted and their abilities were unrestrained. However, such a wonderful cave abode was only a manifestation of the cultivator's hesitation and persistence. In fact, it could even be said that it was just evidence of the cultivator's indecisiveness. While these cultivators were divided, in the depths of the ice field below, the 5 cultivators who came down to explore had already settled down around the source of the law of ice and began to cultivate. However, after they approached the source of the law of ice, they could clearly see what was happening inside. They knew that the situation was not as bad as they had imagined, but it was not as smooth as they had thought either. The ice creature did not reverse the situation. Instead, it turned around and killed its opponent. However, it did not get wiped out by its opponent just like that. At this moment, the situation inside had clearly fallen into a stalemate. Moreover, the one who had the upper hand was the ice creature's opponent, the powerful cultivator who had just stepped into this world not long ago, but had already achieved what they wanted to do. At this moment, in their eyes, they saw that the powerful cultivator did not care about the ice creature at all. After sealing it, he began to cultivate. If an ordinary creature saw the scene in the depths of the source of the law of ice, it would definitely be difficult for them to analyze the truth. They might even think that the ice creature had been wiped out and that the powerful cultivator had already won. However, these 5 cultivators were different. Their thinking, analytical, and observational abilities had all reached an unimaginable level. In the blink of an eye, they had roughly analyzed the truth from what they had seen. It was precisely because they had analyzed this that they changed their original plan of leaving after taking a look. Instead, they began to cultivate near the source of the law of ice. This part of the world was extremely vast, and there were countless places of cultivation that were like the source of this cold rule. If they were truly dedicated to cultivation, they would have left this ice field many years ago and headed to other regions in search of similar places of opportunity. However, because of the hatred in their hearts, they had stayed here for so many years. They experienced everything in this ice field and sensed any movements within it. Even the extraordinary powers that they had regained were based on the ice field and the source of the law of ice as a template. Under such circumstances, the extraordinary powers that they had regained all formed a subtle connection with the source of the law of ice from a certain point of view. The various subtle connections allowed them to use the source of the law of ice to improve themselves and sublimate themselves, just like Luo Fan. Hence, staying here and looking at the source of the cold laws was enough for them to continue their cultivation. This could not be said to be a blessing in disguise. It was just that they had chosen this possibility among the countless possibilities that they had because of their environment. If they had decisively left back then, even if they did not return to their own world and chose a different place in this world from the ice field, the extraordinary powers that they had regained would not have been like this. The source of the extraordinary powers would not have been the source of the law of ice before them. If that was the case, staying here would only be torture. They would need to use all means at all times to stop the source of the law of ice from rejecting them and corroding them. Luo Fan sensed the arrival of these cultivators right away. The source of the law of ice could be said to be the source of the entire ice field. The ice field had only appeared because of it. At this moment, Luo Fan was at the deepest part of the source of the law of ice. It could be said that he was at the core of the source of the law of ice. Under such circumstances, everything that happened in the ice field would naturally be reflected in his heart, and he could sense it clearly. How could he not know that those cultivators had appeared in the ice field? He was very clear about the intentions of those cultivators. However, he could not be bothered with their arrival. He did not welcome them, nor did he chase them away like before. After all, he did not have any real enmity with those cultivators. Previously, he was unwilling to cooperate with them because they did not warn him, so he directly threw them out. That was only a response to their actions of not warning him. After that, after throwing them out, he didn't care about it anymore. To him, the status of these cultivators was equivalent to that of strangers. Under such circumstances, it did not matter to him whether these cultivators left or entered the field of ice. As long as they did not disturb him, it was fine. At this moment, these cultivators were waiting outside and did not enter the source of the law of ice. They clearly could not disturb him. Since that was the case, he naturally could not be bothered with them. At this moment, he only focused on sensing the various details of the source of the law of heat in his body that was triggered by the source of the law of ice in the outside world. As he comprehended this, he felt that his realm was increasing at a speed that could be seen with the naked eye. His worldview absorbed endless nutrients from it and became more and more complete, more and more perfect, and more harmonious. As for the heat in his body, it became more and more mysterious. In fact, various mysteries gradually appeared in the heat, causing the heat to gradually become closer to magic power. In the past, something like magic power was merely an extremely basic power to Luo Fan. In the end, he even completely abandoned this power when he cultivated. Instead, he directly used power, which was originally an invisible existence, as a carrier for him to use extraordinary powers. It could be said that it was a carrier for extraordinary powers that he had already eliminated. However, that was only in the past. In the past, his extraordinary powers were not restricted at all. Magic power, as a power that naturally contained extraordinary characteristics, could naturally be condensed by him, refined, and then discarded at will. However, in this world, magic power, as a power that naturally contained extraordinary characteristics, was naturally rejected by this world. Chapter 26:17. At this moment, the heat was gradually transforming into magic power. In the depths of it, a natural feeling was gradually born, and it was acknowledged by this world. In other words, it was an extraordinary quality that even this world could not suppress. These transcendent characteristics compressed all kinds of incredible effects into the heat, making the uses of the heat more and more abundant. Not only did it make it easier for Luo Fan to achieve certain transcendent effects, but it also made many transcendent effects that were originally impossible possible. For example, the creation of heaven and earth, the original heat. Although Luo Fan could use his superb skills to do all kinds of things that originally could only be done with extraordinary abilities, such as performing all kinds of magical powers that originally could only be performed with the power in his body. However, things like the creation of heaven and earth were ultimately not something that could be done with his power. After all, no matter what, the heat was still heat. Although he could perform all kinds of magical powers through skills, it was ultimately impossible to achieve extraordinary power and violate the law of conservation of energy. However, now that the heat had that extraordinary quality, the restriction of the law of conservation of energy had become smaller and smaller. Obviously, it was necessary for a world to be self-sufficient if it wanted to become a world. And self-sufficiency in itself violated the law of conservation of energy. The law of conservation of energy stated that energy could not be created out of thin air, nor would it disappear out of thin air. It could only be transferred from one place to another. And self-sufficiency clearly meant that all of one's consumption could be replenished from one's own body. In other words, one could create the energy and matter that one needed out of thin air. This obviously did not conform to the law of conservation of energy. Under such circumstances, ordinary heat obviously could not surpass the law of conservation of energy. Therefore, with Luo fan support, the heat might be able to achieve the effects of various extraordinary magical powers and achieve all kinds of things that originally only unimaginable extraordinary abilities could do. However, forming a complete, self-sufficient, and stable world was ultimately not something that could be achieved. Of course, this was only strictly speaking. If it was really just to open up a space or to have some kind of self-sufficient source of heaven and earth with Luo fan skills, it was naturally possible to open up a world. However, it was obvious that he wasn't just using heat to split open the world. It didn't have much of an impact on the previous conclusion. That was the case with the heat before, but as extraordinary characteristics were continuously generated in the heat had unknowingly broken the limits of the law of conservation of energy. As more and more of those extraordinary qualities appeared, the ability to break through became stronger and stronger. Finally, at a certain stage, at a certain level, when the extraordinary characteristics were concentrated to a certain extent, the heat would be able to completely break through the limits of the law of conservation of energy. At that time, with Luo fan's means, he would be able to use the heat to construct the world and construct the world with just a thought. In that case, it would be easy for the heat to split the heavens and earth. Of course, creating the world with heat was only the most obvious and direct manifestation of the transformation of heat. As a matter of fact, there were many other uses for heat that had supernatural qualities. If he really wanted to walk to the end of a path, Luo fan could even use the heat to support his worldview, his path of cultivation, and even use it to resist the catastrophes. Of course, that was only a possibility. If he really wanted to walk this path, he would have to work billions of times harder than he did now. He might even have to convert everything in his body into heat and change all his concepts accordingly. Even his worldview would probably have to be reconstructed. Obviously, for Luo fan, doing so would not be worth it. It would almost be equivalent to completely subverting his own path of cultivation and the origin of life. By then, the possibility of him becoming a true sage would probably be tens of thousands of times smaller than the path of cultivation that he was currently taking while Luo fan was immersed in his comprehension. Time passed by minute. Unknowingly, 1,000 years had passed. The 1,000 years were naturally only 1,000 years in the source of the law of cold. For the world where the ice creature was, it was only a few seconds. During this period of time, even if the world had completely lost its binding force, it still could not dissipate so quickly. Moreover, the ice creature's decision was rather decisive. Back then, when it saw that the situation was not right, it had already brazenly extracted the origin of the world to maintain the slow flow of time. Therefore, the world was still very far away from completely collapsing and losing its binding force. According to the degree of collapse, based on the flow of time inside the world could still last for at least 10 days to half a month. Based on the difference in the flow of time inside and outside, 10 days to half a month inside would probably be calculated in millions or even tens of millions of years outside. Such a long time was clearly a good thing for both Luo fan and the ice creature's main body. This seemed a little contradictory. After all, Luo fan and the ice creature were enemies. Normally, what was good for one side should be bad for the other. However, things are clearly not like that. Right now, for the ice creature, it had to stall for time until its main body arrived to deal with Luo fan. Under such circumstances, the longer it could last, the more advantageous it would be. In the end, when its main body arrived, it would be the best result if he was still the same. Based on this logic, the elongation of time was a good thing for him. For Luo fan, although the situation was different, having more time was clearly a good thing. After all, he did not have to spend any effort to deal with the ice creature's incarnation. Instead, he focused all his attention on his own cultivation. Under such circumstances, the slower the ice creature's main body arrived, the more time he would have to cultivate, and naturally, the stronger he would become. In this way, the slower the ice creature's main body arrived, it was naturally a good thing for him. On this day, Luo fan's heart trembled slightly. He suddenly heard a strange sound coming from his body. This sound was extremely strange. It was as if some weak force had torn apart some obstacle that was blocking it, or as if some creature had directly broken the eggshell that wrapped itself around it. Along with this sound, there were more and more similar sounds that were getting more and more concentrated. The strange fluttering sound spread all over his body and even vaguely spread to the outside world. It affected the source of the cold laws around him, causing the surrounding cold laws to tremble strangely at this moment. The trembling was extremely subtle, and it was even more mysterious. Amidst the subtle trembling, a strange sense of transformation was transmitted. It was as if the source of the cold laws had undergone some sort of change that involved the origin. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribable joy from the bottom of his heart. At this moment, he felt that the heat circulation system in his body had unknowingly completely integrated into his body. The extremely condensed and even solid heat that could only circulate in this heat circulation system had completely disappeared at this time, as if it didn't exist at all. Of course, this was not because he had completely lost all the heat that he had painstakingly condensed. Instead, it was because the heat had already broken through the shackles of the heat circulation system. At this moment, it had brazenly integrated into his entire body. This change was rather strange for the heat. It was as if the heat had unknowingly become an inseparable part of his body. Heat itself was a kind of ordinary thing. It was an invisible existence without any extraordinary characteristics. It was precisely because of this existence that the heat could be used by Luo Fan in this world that completely restricted extraordinary abilities. He could absorb the heat into his body and then use it through various skills. However, in the past, the reason why Luo Fan could control the heat was not only because of his strong willpower and unimaginable strength utilization skills, but also because of his powerful body. It was because his body could withstand the aftermath of the heat. It was thought that his body had a strong enough foundation to support the existence of the heat circulation system. However, even so, when he mobilized the heat inside his body, he had to follow the heat circulation system. He dared not easily let the heat break through the heat circulation system. Otherwise, his body would suffer irreparable injuries if he was not careful. But now, the heat energy was completely unrestricted by the heat circulation system, and it did not harm his body at all. It directly fused into his body and became a part of him. This was clearly a sign that it had surpassed the mortal world. The reason for this was very obvious. It was because the heat had been continuously sublimated by Luo Fan over the years. After continuously comprehending the mysteries of the heat rules in the depths of his body, the extraordinary characteristics it contained had become so powerful that it had changed the nature of the heat, allowing the heat to finally rise from the ordinary level to the extraordinary level. Or, to describe it in another way, this heat had already become another form of magic power. As a power with extraordinary characteristics, the heat could now defy the law of conservation of energy and the ordinary characteristics of the heat itself. Being able to defy the law of conservation of energy meant that Luo Fan no longer had to rely on his own body to be self-sufficient. Instead, he could completely rely on the heat to be self-sufficient. Moreover, as long as he willed it, the heat would completely restrain its destructive power and not harm his body at all. Amidst his joy, he could not help but look at the world beside him. Now that I can split the sky and earth apart, it shouldn't be difficult to deal with him. At that moment, this thought appeared in his mind. Although he had already made up his mind to improve himself to face the main body of the ice creature that might come at any time, he still felt that it was impossible. But this didn't mean that Luo Fan had to cultivate obediently and let the ice creature stall for time. If he really had the chance to deal with the ice creature in that world, Luo Fan definitely wouldn't hold back. But now, he could see the hope of dealing with the ice creature. Now that the heat in his body had gained enough extraordinary characteristics, the strength that Luo Fan could exert had completely crossed into the level of a supreme emperor. This leap was so great that only an existence like Luo Fan who originally had the strength of a peak 6 tribulation powerhouse, could achieve it. If he really started cultivating from the beginning, it would probably take hundreds of millions of years to break through from the false saint stage to the supreme emperor stage, no matter how talented he was or how amazing his realm was. However, to Luo Fan, this kind of achievement wasn't worthy of him being proud at all. After all, be a false saint or a supreme emperor, to him, who was already at the peak of a 6 tribulation powerhouse, they were actually just ants and slightly larger ants. No one would be proud of themselves for being able to compare to a slightly larger ant. Obviously, he wouldn't either. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan's figure flashed, and he appeared outside of that world without any trace of smoke or fire. This world was not much different from before. Even if there was, it was extremely subtle, as if only a few seconds had passed. Seeing this, his expression didn't change at all. He raised his hand and covered that world. There was originally a sealing formation formed by the heat that he had set up outside that world. At that moment, he raised his hand and covered it, and the heat that formed the sealing formation began to make sizzling sounds.